Good afternoon, Supervisor Chavez. Good afternoon, Frank.
Good afternoon, Rhonda. Testing 1, 2, 3.
I can hear you fine.
Great, thank you.
Good afternoon, this is Imre by testing the mic. Good afternoon, this is Imre by testing the mic.
We can hear you, Imre.
Hello,
Thank
thank you.
Hello, this is Miguel doing a mic check for the clerk of the board.
Yes, this is Jay Logan, Los Altos Hills County Fire District.
Hello, we can hear both Miguel and Jay Logan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just giving a 2-minute warning to my colleagues.
Good afternoon, Supervisor Smidian.
Good afternoon, Rhonda. Can you hear me loud and clear?
I sure can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Susan.
Good afternoon, Cindy. How are you?
Oops. No, thank you. I'm right in a bit.
Good afternoon, Supervisor Wasserman.
Good afternoon, Rhonda, and everybody else.
So just as everybody gets settled in, I wanted to give a heads up to both Dr. Smith and or James that there are two issues that I want to just raise with my colleagues. That one, we will have a hard stop today at 5. And second, that I'll ask if James, when you are on the line, if you could let me know. Because the other issue that I wanted to just mention is that, oh, good. In the event of a blackout, a rolling blackout, what I'd like to do is the blackouts are, brownouts are intended to be between an hour and 90 minutes. What makes sense to me is that if we have one of those, that we would, I'm going to use the wrong word, but suspend the meeting and then re-begin the meeting depending on the time of day that happens. I would confer with my colleagues as to any decision we would make about timing.
Yeah, I think we could recess the meeting, and if there's, whoever is still able to be on, because presumably not everyone may necessarily be affected, can communicate that through the meeting.
Yeah, I think the reason I would like to recess the meeting for whatever period of time is necessary is I want to make sure we don't leave out any colleagues or any members of the public. And I know this is new. We just got this information last night, but I'm mentioning that to my colleagues. If there are strong opinions as we get into the meeting, I'd be interested in hearing that. So, Dr. Smith?
Just as an option, the way that we could proceed, if you would like, would be by just using telephone, since the telephone has an alternate power source, but that certainly would be up to the board.
Thank you. I'm also mindful that I have the staff in this building, so it depends on where that brownout goes. Our staff are here, and I'm going to want them to be in a building that doesn't get really hot and that they have the ability to leave if necessary. All right, so with that, I'm going to begin our meeting. I'm going to ask for a roll call, please.
Supervisor Ellenberg,
I'm here.
Supervisor Simidian,
Simidian present.
Supervisor Cortese,
Here.
Vice President Wasserman,
Here.
President Chavez.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to my Vice Chair, Vice President Mike Wasserman, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Thank you, Madam President. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the
United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We are now going to go to public comment, and this is an opportunity to speak to an item that is not on the agenda today, but within the purview of the committee.
We have one speaker. The next speaker is Scott Largent. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you will have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Good afternoon, everyone. Scott Largent. I have been picking up cases of water. Yesterday I handed out probably about 6 cases. I have a couple of big ice chests in my van. Between taking lunch from work and then the time I get off, kind of starts over in Willow Glen. I've been working on a house over here. What I do is, just kind of figure out people that need water. No, most of the time they're mentally ill and homeless, and they're barely making it down the road. They're pushing carts, they're hauling their luggage, waiting for a bus that just doesn't have the room in it. What I'm wondering is why I don't see a county vehicle with ice chests in it and water. why the police aren't handing out this type of water. Not just San Jose PD, all 13 cities, maybe even the sheriff's department. I don't understand. Now, this is a basic thing, and I've talked about water. I've talked about restrooms. The park downtown right now. Now this is everywhere now, but the main ones of St. James Park and also over near the Hyatt at the Cesar Chavez Park are the worst that I've ever seen them my entire life now. This is not okay. Why are you ignoring this? Why isn't there not some tents, tarps, like, setups, water, people from the county? Where are these resources out there right now? When I hand out this water, it's the most amazing thing when you give somebody a simple thing like a water, and it's coming out of the ice chest and it's all nice and cool. It is literally like handing out $100 bills. When you see that person's expression, and most of the people on the street have more teeth than I do, but these massive smiles and the thank you and just how appreciative they are that somebody stopped to acknowledge that they even exist. But you guys drive right past them. I don't understand. I really don't.
You're muted, Madam President.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Scott, for your public comment. And what I'd like to do is we're going to go to the agenda. And what I'd like to just make a recommendation to my colleagues that we take the items. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Madam President. The comment I wanted to make, please, after reviewing the agenda and materials for this week's series of budget hearings, I'd like to propose 2 actions to help us move through this week's important agenda in a manner that will help us focus on the most important decision points. I believe doing so will make us more effective and focused. First, after hearing consolidated public comment, I would move forwarding to Friday the 6 departments on the agenda for today that do not have any revised recommendations, unless, of course, one of my colleagues would like to hear and discuss specific questions about one of those budgets. That said, I would move approval, Madam President, of items 10, appropriation for contingencies, item 11, Board of Supervisors district budgets, item 12, clerk of the board, item 32, assessor, item 35, county council, and item 41, county communications. I will make a similar motion tomorrow and Wednesday on a few other items. My second suggestion is I ask that we hear the multiple items under each remaining department as one consolidated item, with a consolidated presentation and consolidated public comment. For example, I ask that we hear items 13 through 31 related to the Office of the County Executive together. Of course, if a supervisor wants to cast a different vote or abstention on a particular item within the department, that can be noted as we do when we have a consent calendar, or a particular item can be voted on separately if preferred. And those suggestions I thought kind of fit in where our consent normally fits in, Madam President, which is why I waited till after public comment and before starting the regular agenda.
Thank you. Supervisor, could you name the numbers again that you would like to put on consent?
Yes, ma'am. And again, these are all items to my knowledge that do not have any revised recommendations. Those numbers are 10, 11, 12, 32, 35, and 41. 6 items total.
So that is a motion.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second that.
We have a motion and a second. Any more discussion on those items? So we're going to, I'm going to ask for a, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask for a roll call vote. Oh, I'm sorry, if there's any public comment? Any staff comment? Then I'm going to ask for a roll call vote. And by the
Supervisor,
way, the vote, pardon me, Nancy, the vote is just to move these items to Friday.
Correct.
Susan?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you had your hand up. Okay. I'm sorry, Nancy, go ahead.
Supervisor Ellenberg,
Yes.
Supervisor Semidian,
Semidian, aye.
Supervisor Cortese,
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman,
Yes.
President Chavez.
Yes. Let me just say what my hesitancy is for my colleagues is that I have a concern about some of the approaches we're taking overall. And so I was just processing that while in real time. All right. So then what I'd like to do is we'll move to the staff. We'll begin with the county exec's budget and what that
I'm sorry,
means.
just a quick interruption. Are we, Supervisor Wasserman had two suggestions. The first was
Yeah, I was getting
those.
to the second one.
Oh, got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You bet. So to that end, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the overview, and this is items 4, 5, 6, and 7. We will hear those together. Then we will take public comment, and if there are any actions to be taken that the board would like to take, we can do that at that point. So we'll do that throughout the day. We'll take every item under the particular topic as a whole, and then take public comment on those. That make sense? Okay, great. Thank you. We'll now move to staff on items 4, 5, 6, and 7.
Thank you, Madam President. I have just 3 slides and a little bit of discussion, then I will turn it over to Greg Aturia, our budget director, to go through the details. But as you know, this is a unique year. The board has already approved the recommended budget back in June of 2020 on the 23rd. That was effectively a continuing budget because we used significant amount of one-time funds to fill a $300 million structural deficit in our general fund. We're anticipating between $300 and $600 million annual deficit and structural deficit ongoing, and so we were postponing significant action until now, the end of August, when the board has to make a final decision and approve a final budget. But the final budget will not be final. We will have another modification of the budget, well, at least 2 more modifications of the budget, one in November and one in February, once we know more from the state and the federal government. We were hoping at this point to know a lot more, because during the time period that the board was discussing the recommended budget, the federal government was discussing the HEROES Act. Subsequently, they still have not passed the bill, which would theoretically give us some additional revenue. Also, because they have not done that, excuse me, there's question marks about the state budget because of triggers that were placed in the state budget that will reduce funding to Health and Human Services if sufficient money does not come to the state from the federal government. So those are still big questions. We did get some resolution with regard to ERAF and a realignment from the state. However, in sum total, it was not good news because they ended up reducing what we were counting on of about $40 million during that time period. So this budget is going to be a discussion of reductions over the next 3 days. When you discuss the issues, we will make note of the board's concerns, and we will come back on Friday with a finalized proposal for your action. The budget that you're going to hear today and for the next 3 days solves $144 million of that $300 to $600 million structural deficit, but we do think we will need more. Our priorities used during the time period that we administratively developed this proposal was we wanted to preserve services to the greatest extent possible. We wanted to focus our savings on the elimination of vacant funded positions in order to preserve those services and to preserve jobs. We wanted to deal as best we could with board priorities that have been expressed before, department priorities and organizational needs, and we wanted to prepare for further reductions. We also made an effort to match our reductions with reductions in revenue, and we did get some reductions in revenue that we were not expecting, and we're preparing for February and November. In order to do that, we asked certain departments to match or come up with reduction targets. These are not the only departments that will be targeted throughout the year. These are just the first ones. The strategy we used here is to look at departments that had grown significantly over the last 5 years, or departments where the service level had decreased significantly over those last 5 years. We also focused on departments that utilize the most general fund. And we did those things because we thought that if the service level had decreased, we could probably eliminate vacant funded positions without any effect. And if the positions were vacant, certainly the services are continuing as they are now. And larger departments are more able to reduce during that time period. We gave these reduction targets, you can see labeled August targets. And we anticipated that those targets would be repeated in November and February. However, as I mentioned, in addition to that 88 million, we also lost 40 million in the process from the state proposal. The department's responses, some departments made the targets, other departments were far less than the targets. Health and hospital actually exceeded the target because their intent is to have one reduction rather than 3 reductions. So we acknowledge that and left their numbers higher. So the department response we revised and focused, as I said, upon unfilled, unfunded, or funded positions, vacant funded positions. And so you can see we did that, and the total is about $144 million of reductions. AB 109 was not expected to be reduced, but the funding from the state was reduced, so that was included, even though that was not an initial target. The departments that we did not include are those general fund departments where funding and particular services are required. They're off there to the left: finance, assessor, clerk of the board, county council, public defender, ESA, medical examiner, EMS, and SEPA, and then departments that have particularly their own funding, like parks and library, and fire, and roads and airports we did not include in the target. Again, this is just a start. We expect more later, but we think that we gave you a proposal here that is relatively easy because the positions, majority of the positions, vast majority of the positions are vacant, and the ones that are filled, we have proposals already from departments to move those incumbents into funded positions. So with this action of this on this budget, no one will go out the door. So with that, I will turn it over to Greg Turia, who has his own budget proposal. And somehow I have to get out of here.
Good afternoon. This is Greg Turia, County Budget Director. And I'll invite the clerk of the board to pull up the PowerPoint presentation called the Budget Hearing Overview. Thank you. And if you could advance to the next slide when you get a chance. And if you're able to advance one slide, please. Thank you. So as everyone has broadly described 2020, or this calendar year, as an unprecedented year, it should be no surprise that building a budget for fiscal year 2021 is a challenge and certainly full of uncertainties. I'm picking up an echo. If you guys can mute, thank you. The goals throughout this process of building this budget has been to maintain service levels to the extent possible, focusing on efficiencies, sustainable services so we can keep the future community needs in mind, and preservation of the existing workforce to the extent possible. Certainly the challenges is building a budget has to do with all the uncertainties regarding the pandemic and the underlying economic recession caused by the pandemic. Certainly is with uncertainties with federal and state funding, as well as our own county revenues. And then certainly the structural deficit that cannot be solved just with one-time funding solutions, and the challenge to come up with ongoing funding solutions. Next slide, please. So the strategy, as we've discussed with the board for the last few months, has been to develop and present recommendations for revisions with an iterative approach, with reductions proposed through the hearing this week, as well as coming back in November and in February through our traditional mid-year processes. County Executive Dr. Smith mentioned. We've already been eliminating ongoing reserves, utilizing one-time funding sources to get us to this point so we can start with a recommended budget that's balanced, using those one-time resources to provide in these discussions this week for identifying ongoing solutions. And as Dr. Smith mentioned, focusing on the deletion of vacant positions where possible, and minimizing impacts on services and operations. We'll still keep an eye out for the future. Next slide, please. And just a reminder for the timeline, the county executive's recommended budget was published on June 15th, and it was accepted by the board on June 23rd to serve as an interim budget for operating purposes. And in this week's hearing, the board will be asked to consider updated financial information, the aforementioned or revised recommendations from the county administrator, from the county executive, as well as recommendations to rebalance the budget. And we are targeting this Friday, August 21st, as the date for final adoption of the balanced budget for fiscal year 2021. However, and this is an important note, that even with the county executive's revised budget actions, the county will still have a large structural deficit requiring further cost reductions in November and thereafter. Next slide, please. To help illustrate this, we updated the chart that was presented to the board in June. And the chart that we gave to the board in June, we showed a structural deficit hovering around 400 million, in the range of 300 to 600 million, given all the variables. However, if the board was to agree to the county executive's revised budget recommendations presented at the hearing this week, we can make some improvement on that structural deficit, and a revised 5-year projection showing the gaps between revenues and expenditures is improved a little bit, but still our baseline projection is a structural budget deficit of around 300 million in nature, even if the county executive's recommendations are approved by the board this week. Next slide, please. We still have the same variables for the most part that we need to be mindful of: continuing state budget impacts, additional decline of economically sensitive revenues, and the cost for the growth in a unit of service over the next few years. There are variables there as well. But that overall range, instead of 300 to 600 million, can be improved to a range of 200 to 500 million if the board approves the revised recommendations presented by the county executive this week. Next slide, please. And new information since publication of the recommended budget on June 15th includes updated projections of general fund revenue. We have updated projections for property tax. Some pros and cons here. A little bit of a projected increase for the regular secure roll growth. However, as Dr. Smith mentioned, our revised estimate for ERAF based on recent and anticipated state actions is a 40 million decline in that portion of the property tax revenue. The estimated revenue from penalties and costs on delinquent taxes is declining by 24 million based on a governor's executive order to waive those penalties and costs for the year. Also, our projected revenue for public safety sales tax is up a little bit by about 5 million since our projection that we used in June for the recommended budget. We also need to consider the fiscal import actions approved after April 21st until this date. And we've got those factored. And then we also have an updated estimate for the ending fund balance for last fiscal year. The recommended budget relying on an estimate that was based on analysis in May. However, last month we were able to obviously have the advantage of some additional hindsight, and we have an updated estimate, but it's about 22 million less than the estimate we used to balance the recommended budget. Next slide, please. The revised recommended county executive recommendations are agendized for individual consideration, and obviously will be considered individually or in groups as suggested by Supervisor Wasserman earlier. The net result of all these ongoing savings from these actions is about 140 million to the general fund with a net one-time cost of about 4 million. In the general fund, these recommended actions reduce the net FTE or personnel count by about 344 positions, and in the general fund by an additional 133 positions, and net ongoing savings in other funds of about 2.7. And the reason why it's only 2.7 in the other funds is because of those 133.5 positions, the vast majority of those are in the hospital system. And we're capturing that cost savings through a recommended reduced subsidy from the general fund to the hospital system. So we're capturing that savings and reflected in the general fund savings of 140 mentioned above to show where the net effect of those recommended actions lie. Next slide, please. And then additional adjustments to rebalance include our concurrence with some of the management auditor recommended actions. We'll have a separate agenda item we'll cover in a few minutes to go over the details on that. There were a number of areas where the management auditor had pointed out things that we already had built into our county executive revised recommendations as well. And so in addition to that 15.1, we also have the savings that we had already factored into the revised recommended actions. The total of all adjustments since the recommended budget was published has $105 million net ongoing savings and a one-time net savings of 10 million. These savings certainly will help decrease that structural budget deficit and prepare the county for the federal and state impacts coming up and continue to support the pandemic response. Next slide, please. So to rebalance, recognizing that by having approximately $100 million in net ongoing solutions from these revised recommended actions, we're able to address the general fund deficit with roughly $100 million in solutions, which means we can recapture some of the one-time uses that were used to balance the recommended budget last June to help address many needs that are otherwise unfunded and unmet in the recommended budget. There's a small adjustment to the contingency reserve amount to meet the board's policy target of 5%. There is a recommendation to set aside $8 million for labor and wage realignment costs that have been negotiated or in the process of being negotiated with labor groups where those costs are outside of the estimates that we have in the recommended budget. We want to recognize the need to set aside a little bit for that difference. Further, we're recommending setting aside 20 million one-time basis for one-time labor reduction transition costs. Because as we downsize the labor force, we're already starting to see some one-time costs. There's increased cost in unemployment that we can tell already that our budget for unemployment is going to be inadequate. Plus, we're already beginning to see higher than usual expected retirements, and we anticipate there's going to be a significant number of retirements this fall, and each of those retirements are going to have buyout for accrued leaves and one-time costs, but nonetheless costs that we don't currently have anticipated in the recommended budget. And then based on our experience from downsizing during the Great Recession, there are any number of one-time costs that come up during that transition that we need to prepare for. And then also we recognize there's a need to set aside for negative impacts from the federal and state budget reductions that are forthcoming, where we don't know exactly which revenues and which departments are going to be impacted, but we do anticipate significant impacts. And so we do need to set aside some for that. On everyone's mind right now is we do not yet have additional federal stimulus money out of Congress for state and local government, as many of us had hoped would have occurred by this point this summer. And the state budget was adopted with automatic additional trigger cuts in late October if the federal government does not provide at least $14 billion to the state of California in new flexible federal aid. And at this point, it's uncertain if they'll get that or a portion of that. So we do need to prepare for another round of cuts in October, November, and we wanted to have some set aside to help us prepare for that. And then we also recognize that additional funding is needed for the pandemic response for the remainder of this fiscal year. The federal funding has been inadequate in a couple of different ways so far for our pandemic response. First, in volume, the amount of funding so far has been inadequate in amount, but also in its inflexibility. The federal government's got too many restrictions on the funding it's provided so far. So we recognize that with these two types of inadequacies, some additional funding is needed. Next slide, please. The recommended budget that was submitted to the board in June included an total estimated revenue of 7.8 billion. The board may remember that in the past we used to show this every year in pie charts. We've learned more recently that a reader can get a better sense of proportion with a bar chart. So we're now going to a bar chart, and this does help you see as far as sense of proportion. Charges for services where we get reimbursed costs. This is largely in the health and human service area, but there are other departments that get costs recovered through fees. And that is our kind of our largest slice of the pie, so to speak, for our revenue. And then taxes, and this is where our discretionary revenues, about 1.6 billion in discretionary revenue from taxes. There's a few other franchise fees and fines in the other category that have some discretionary nature to it. But we thought this slide was important given the structural deficit we have in the general fund is due to inadequate discretionary dollars of the 300 to 600 million, and to show that 300 to 600 million shortfall is a big portion of this 1.6 billion in discretionary dollars that we receive. And then of course, we have the federal and state funding sources. And then the other category from the state's perspective, these are local dollars, but they all have state restrictions. We call them realignment funds, AB 109, which we've talked about. They're really kind of a state and federal origin from our perspective. They get received in restricted funds, and then we transfer them to recover allowable costs. Next slide, please. And then also for our recommended budget that we submitted in June, total appropriation of 8.3 billion. We want to show of that total budget, nearly half of that is in the health and hospital arena and the departments that report up to HHC. And then about 2 billion of that 8.3 in general government, and that reports up to FGOC, and about $1 billion in CSFC, it's mostly social services, child support services. Then the public safety justice is also roughly $1 billion, and then the housing land use is a much smaller perspective in relation. Next slide, please. And then for this year, we wanted to add this one other slide because it's so important and it's very much related to our structural deficit of the 300 to 600 million dollar deficit. I want to focus on the planned use of discretionary revenue in the recommended budget for this fiscal year. It's about 2.1 billion. Again, that's the 1.6 billion in taxes. There's a little bit of other discretionary revenue, as I mentioned, and then relying on fund balance. The one-time fund balance, which is discretionary revenue received in past years that wasn't used, and we're currently balanced on using it all to temporarily balance the budget until we deal with our structural deficit. And then I thought it was important to show how much of that discretionary use of discretionary revenue is used by departments based on the departments and their reporting structure. So for the discretionary revenue, over 740 million of it, or 35% of it, is used by the departments that report up to PSJC, or Public Safety and Criminal Justice departments. And then about 30% for the FGOC budget units. But I thought it was also important to point out, of that 650 million, nearly 200 million of that is for the general fund contingency and special programs, which are non-departmental expenses. And so by the time you factor that in, it's really maybe only about 450, 460 million for the actual departments that are in FGOC. HHC, that's the health and hospital system, has about 25%, but that also includes the general fund subsidy to VMC. CSFC, that's SSA and child support services, about 10%. They rely heavily on federal and state subventions. And then the housing and land use and environment and transportation departments are almost all funded by special revenues and fees and state grants. Relatively little discretionary revenue that goes there. Next slide, please. And this is just a general reminder for our audience. I know the board's well aware, but the county's budget has to be developed and managed in compliance with the state constitution and state, as well as the county charter. Next slide, please. And as required from all three of those sources, the Constitution, statutes, and charter, the recommended budget has to be balanced, and the recommended budget is balanced for each fund, where the available resources is equal to the use of resources in each fund. Next slide, please. As well as all the recommended adjustments to the recommended budget are balanced as well in order to maintain that balanced budget. So these are the math for the numbers that we've already covered in the previous slides. So I want to focus a little bit on the bottom. With the recommended adjustments to the recommended budget, the solutions are increased from an ongoing solutions perspective. Again, around 100 million in ongoing solutions, and replacing the one-time solutions that we had to temporarily use to get us to this point in the process, so we can have these hearings and these discussions on what additional solutions are going to be, that we need to start with to get properly dealing with the structural deficit. Next slide, please. So that concludes the budget portion of the report. Separately, because there's a lot of information and interest, want to provide a little update on the COVID-19 funding to our general audience as well. Next slide, please. The board has already seen this information from recent reports, but just again, for the broader audience, over the course of this fiscal year, the fiscal year that we're talking about for a budget, we are anticipating expenditures up near $250 million. 238 is our current estimate for anticipated levels. Of course, this cannot include things we don't anticipate or don't know about yet. But the things we do know about, the testing, the public health response, sheltering, and outreach costs, are things that we're obviously mindful of and want to share broadly with the community. Next slide, please. And then certainly we recognize that we've had some, not enough, but we've had some federal funding and the coronavirus relief revenue that was received last April. In part, 158 of it was received then. We're going to get some additional amounts through the state this fiscal year, another 31 million for a total of 189. Some of our costs we believe are going to be able to get partially reimbursed from FEMA. They tend to reimburse 75% of some of our response costs. We'll be submitting those claims, and we're going to plan on using some of that coronavirus relief fund as our 25% match to those. And we also know that there's going to be some costs that we're incurring now and in the future that's not going to be covered by the federal and state sources. Because of the inflexibility of those sources, and to date, the inadequacies of those sources. So we're going to continue our legislative advocacy in Washington, D.C. To help fill in some of that anticipated shortfall. And then, and because of that shortfall for right now, at least, we are anticipating it's need to provide at least some one-time funding from the county general fund to help close some of that cost. And that's why that was mentioned as one of the important rebalancing proposals for the board consideration this week. Next slide, please. And then again, separate from budget, separate from COVID, wanted to provide an update on the cash report. Budget management is different than cash management. However, we do need to continue to monitor state and federal payments and property tax payments to assure timely cash flow and manage that cash flow. Next slide, please. So we wanted to provide an update to the board and to the community on cash balances as of the end of last fiscal year. In the general fund, roughly $1 billion. We had still some payment delays from federal and state government for VMC. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later this morning, later this afternoon. So we've got that recognized. And then we also have about $1 billion, what we call the trans funds. The trans stands for tax revenue anticipation notes. These are basically short-term cash flow loans if we need to access them, like we did during the Great Recession. And we keep track of those separately because these are the funds that we can easily and actively use for active cash management and advances between funds. And so overall, look at this, you can see that at least we ended the fiscal year with the adequate cash despite the $8.3 billion spending plan. At any given time, we have cash assets. However, it's an important however, we do have some concerns about cash flow in a couple sources. So next slide, I'll talk about that. So one of them is the timely reimbursement from the federal and state government for our hospital services. We have several significant accounts receivables where revenues have been earned, and we're waiting on the state to submit those reimbursements. There is a resulting need for occasional cash advances as a result of that. The administration is continually assessing how to best address this issue, and we'll have a little more conversation on that later this morning on the mechanics of it. But it's an important one for us to watch. And also just a reminder for those that weren't here during the last recession, there were other federal state reimbursements that were held up too by the state in social services and other programs when the state was having its own cash flow problems. And it dealt with that by withholding state reimbursements and not passing through federal funding to the counties in a timely fashion because they had their own cash problems. So we very much need to monitor the state's cash situation as well. Next slide, please. And then for this year, this is new. We didn't have this issue during the last recession, but the governor issued an executive order on May 6th, suspending late payment penalties and fees for property tax. As I mentioned earlier, right off the bat, that means we're going to lose $25 million in discretionary revenue from the penalties and fee suspensions, but also there's a possible cash flow impact from this. We do not yet know to what extent property tax owners will choose not to pay on time. But if it is a significant amount of property tax that's withheld, this could become an emerging cash flow issue as well. As everyone's well aware, the county depends on property tax payments well over $1 billion each year for not just the general fund, but for our library system and the fire districts and the park fund as well. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, the recommended budget as amended is balanced between available sources and uses. However, a large structural deficit remains. The county's pandemic response requires additional funding, hopefully from the state, but also to some degree from local funds to operate through the remainder of the fiscal year. And the cash balance is currently adequate, but we need to carefully watch the timeliness of federal and state reimbursements and the payment of property taxes. And this concludes our overview. And if there are any questions on that from the board before we going to discussions of the management auditor's report and our response.
What I would like to do is take all reports, and then I'm going to ask my colleagues to just keep track of their questions, and we'll do what we normally do, which is give everybody a chunk of time to go through them. Thank you. So we'll now move to Harvey Rose.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This is Cheryl Solov. I'm the board's management audit manager, and some of my staff are also on the line as well. And so I don't know exactly what, areas you might want to focus on, but I thought I would start with just a brief overview of sort of our approach this year, because it is a little bit different. Typically we spend a lot of time just looking at the assumptions underlying specific budgetary amounts that are proposed. In this case, we wanted to cast a much wider net. And so the report includes both, recommendations related to specific dollar amounts that are in the budget that are based on various assumptions where, we think maybe the assumptions have been updated by changes or, other factors. But also we wanted to make sure that we were, in fact, providing the board with a very broad-based set of options, because we don't know what the future looks like with regard to the county's cash, with regard to the county's obligations in terms of, COVID response, social services needs, and other factors that we felt like were a little bit different this year. So we tried to spend a little more time looking at larger, sort of more structural issues. Where is there cash? What could be borrowed? What could be allocated differently? And so, we, depending on how you look at it, we came up with about $552.8 million that could either be potentially borrowed for cash flow purposes, or reduced in the budget in order to save some cash and to without impacting operations. In addition to that, we also had recommendations that related to just efficiency issues, trying to create sort of an opportunity for a long-term discussion about the structural deficits. And so some of that is just more long-term. And so within that, that includes the information that we included about the cash advances to VMC. It includes the potential to discuss providing the same or similar services with less expensive personnel, so civilianization of badge personnel where appropriate, and the potential to convert some physicians to over a long period, of course, to non-physician providers. So all of those things are sort of separate from the actual budget itself, and looking at cash. And we tried to create a menu of options, not knowing where this was eventually going to end up. And we wanted to make sure that there were choices and options out there, not just for this immediate day, but going forward. So with that, I just wanted to frame that so that it was clear kind of where our head was around this. And so I can go through our individual recommendations related to the budget document if you would like, or.
Well, I think it may make sense, unless if you're comfortable with this, to go to pages 8 and 9 of your report, packet pages 110 and 111, and just briefly review each one of the recommendations
Okay.
we're making.
Okay. So these are sort of the kind of these aren't things that are technically in the budget. If you're talking about page 8 and 9 of our report.
So Cheryl, maybe here's what I'm trying to ask for your focus on. If you could focus for us on the key areas where you are recommending that the board may want to take a specific action. I use those 2 pages because they are the summaries. At least this is the heading of it. It's a summary of your proposals and the administration's response. So if you have another area you'd like to start, fine. I was just trying to give you an area to focus on.
Okay, so I think I'll just begin on page 3 of our report, which is where there's 14 items that we put forth as a potential for review. And the first is the excess funding of vacant positions. Although the administration has indicated opposition to that, we think most of this is actually has been or will be implemented with the adoption of the budget. As you know, with the amendment that they've set forth. I saw Supervisor Wasserman's hand up.
I'm going to go ahead and, Mike, if it's okay, I'd like her to finish her presentation, if that's okay, Mike? Or
yes, I was just referencing to the chart that you referred to on package page 110. Cheryl just read item number 1, which was the excess funding. It's that chart that you mentioned, Madam President. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, and you're asking her to explain where there's significant differences, I think, between her and administration's recommendations.
Yes, she went to another page in her presentation.
Oh.
I'm using, Cheryl, what I'm using is your report that has I was just using the summary table, but you went back to page 3 of your report, which starts with the budget contingency, budget contingency. So I was trying to find a place that would make it easier for you to walk us through the main recommendations that you have.
So, yeah, I think maybe there's a page number issue here, but
President Chavez, I might be able to. This is Greg Ituria. Cheryl, I believe they're referring to page 8 of 18 and page 9 of 18 of the administration's response to your report, because it shows a side-by-side comparison of the dollar amounts that you proposed in administration's response, and that way both can be covered at the same time. And so if you have, I think that's what they're looking for.
For everyone through the chair, what the chair referenced was packet pages, and that's a cumulative running total. So no matter what the inside pages are, what President Chavez referred to, packet pages, is what all of us should have available to us. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
So you're on packet page 110, did you say?
That's correct.
Okay, my apologies. I'm very sorry.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Way to jump in.
My apologies. Okay, so let's see. So yes, as I was saying regarding excess funding, you know, a lot of that is in their new proposal. So, and I think once they come back in November, there'll be an additional amount there. So, although they've said they oppose it, they're actually implementing it to a substantial degree. So I think there's more agreement there than might have otherwise been apparent. In terms of the VHP fund balance, this falls into that bucket of things that could be where the board could potentially get funds for cash flow purposes. We have a previous opinion from County Council indicating that the county is permitted to purchase, or excuse me, to borrow from those funds. And so based on our analysis, we felt that those monies were in fact available and could be used for that purpose. The next item is informational, and that is $239.8 million, which is money that is in realignment trusts and fire district accounts that also could potentially be borrowed from. The fire district accounts could be borrowed from regardless based on the previous council opinion. However, the rest of this, most of it is money that is in a sub-account of the general fund realignment trust. And so, we don't know for sure whether this could be borrowed against or not. But, excuse me, even if it were not something that could be borrowed against, we think there's a potential to go to the state and request more flexibility in these available funds. So we just wanted to make the board aware of these balances that are there. And in its response, the administration indicated an intent to program more of these dollars. So some of that may show up as a part of the budget next year or in some future year, but we just wanted to make it apparent what that is. Item 4 on that chart is reserves. $5 million of that is a reserve for the bond debt on the adolescent mental health facility. And the reason that we included it here is because we don't think that the debt will be issued and payable within, by June 30th, based on the schedule of construction and other materials that we have. And Nick Menard on our staff could speak to this in more detail if you would like. And the other $1 million is for operating costs for the Vietnamese Service Center. And on both of these, we're not saying that these amounts aren't needed eventually, but we don't think they're needed in the current year because we don't think that the expenditures will actually occur in the current year. So we're just effectively proposing to move those off into the next year if in fact the county needs the money this year, could be available for that. Fuel and tires, part of this is due to the COVID reduction in vehicle use. The administration's agreed with a portion of that. Same thing with TSS projects. This is an ongoing issue where the projects roll over every year and the funds are never spent. So I'm happy to see that they've accepted $13 million of that. Inmate clothing, food, and supplies. This was an analysis that we prepared based on expenditures by, per capita, and the fact that the per capita, the population, the incarcerated population has declined, and so we were trying to capture the savings there. Deferred maintenance, that one is similar to the TSS projects that are perpetually budgeted but the expenditures don't actually occur. So we're just trying to, address that funding where we're not saying that these services shouldn't be provided. We're just pointing to the funding that is typically not used, and we believe this would just sit in fund balance otherwise. They've accepted $31.5 million of the general fund transfers for capital projects that have not yet commenced. So, you know, we'll take what we can get, I suppose. 50% is not too bad. The unused allocations for selected contracts, we think all of that is viable. The administration has narrowed it down a little bit. They've agreed to the EMS trust fund balance use, the actual cash for debt service that we identified, utilities costs, and the pharmaceuticals costs. Those latter items are sort of rolled into the administration's new proposal. So that's where I'm not sure if you wanted additional information.
I think that's fine. Thank you, Cheryl.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'll ask, we're going to just keep going through these proposals till, presentations till we get to the end. Greg, did you want to weigh in now in this section?
No, I could walk through each of those, or if it's the board's pleasure, we have, you know, a detailed write-up to each of these in your packet.
Yeah, why don't we hold off on those, and then when
Okay.
we come back, we can let people ask questions if my colleagues are comfortable with that. Mike, you good? You're the only one I can see, so, okay. Thank you.
Okay. And then we have invited a supplemental presentation from Macias, Genie, and O'Connell, MGO, and I would like for them to give a presentation now. We think one important contribution they can make is to help provide clarification on some of the differences between cash management and budget management with our hospital system. We found the report from the management auditor's office confusing in that regard, and we were did have a fear that there could be misunderstandings as a result. So with the President's permission, I would like to introduce Linda Hurley from Macias, Genie, and O'Connell. And so if she could provide a report, this is their area of expertise. Not only are they the outside, independent outside auditors for the County of Santa Clara, but they also do it for other counties where there are large hospital systems like Los Angeles and whatnot. So they are the experts. And so we asked them to help present the whole cash management situation there, and as it relates to budget or doesn't relate to budget.
All right, thank you. My screen should be sharing with our report, and I am not going to go through page by page in the interest of time, but as Mr. Arturo mentioned, I will be covering a couple key highlights that we want to make sure we help the County Executive Office clarify regarding the general fund support to the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center. So our objective for our engagement was to assist the county in evaluating the general fund cash advances to the medical center. And in doing this, we looked at data as it relates to fiscal year 2019 and 20, the most recent years where cash flows may have slowed down a little bit, requiring additional general fund support to cover current disbursements that need to be paid in a more current time frame overall. I do want to say that for this analysis, we did use some audited information from prior years, but the information for 2020, it's not audited. It still needs to go through that process. We were provided reports, trial balances, and other information from management that are subject to adjustment as the county goes through their year-end closing process for 2020. So our focus was to look at the distinction between cash advances and the general fund operating subsidy. and then to focus on the current liquidity of the medical center based on that available information. So I'm going to jump ahead here to discuss briefly cash advances versus general fund subsidy. So that distinction is where a cash advance is a borrowing that's expected to be paid back with interest. And looking at the information with the general fund and the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center, these cash advances are expected to be temporary, where they're used for the purposes of cash flow while VMC is expecting collection on their receivables. Whereas a subsidy is a direct operating support by the general fund. So it would impact fund balance as well as Valley Medical Center's net position. So the business type activities, which is what Valley Medical Center is really designed to recover all of their costs or a significant portion of their costs through user fees and charges. And to the extent that that cannot occur, which is often the case with county-run hospitals, the general fund will support that difference. And as I mentioned, a cash advance required to be paid back with interest, and there is interest being charged to the Valley Medical Center that is payable to the general fund. And they're really designed to be a cash management strategy for temporary cash flow coverage, where the subsidy is not required or expected to be repaid and is a budget strategy to supplement operational support. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a bit. So to discuss liquidity, we wanted to look at the current liquid assets that the medical center has right now to cover their current liabilities. And in the second bullet point here, we noticed that the medical center is estimating at the end of June 30th to have about almost $895 million in accounts receivable. And that primarily breaks into patient accounts receivable and then due from other governmental entities and third parties. And that is your state and federal support for supplemental programs related to the medical center's activities. So looking at this a little bit further, if you look at the chart on the right-hand side, this is 2020, and this is an estimate of the aging of those patient accounts receivable. And it's roughly around 289 million that are in the aged buckets right now. There's a little bit more that makes up that receivable number, but this is a majority of it. So you can see that a significant portion is in the current bucket, which we classify current is that it hasn't been outstanding for more than 90 days. And the big blue part, the 27%, those are unbilled receivables. But as accounts receivable age, those buckets get smaller and smaller. So it appears that VMC is getting their bills out on timely, and they're also collecting on patient accounts receivable. And all of this is what's expected to be collected in cash over time. So it's already been netted by contractual allowances and other bad debt analysis that would not be collectible. Okay, let me go further down. Regarding liquidity, we used what we call a quick ratio, where we would calculate what the current liquid assets are compared to the current liabilities. And current liabilities is what needs to be dispersed in the very near future. The liquid assets are tended to be defined as cash available, as well as accounts receivable that are less than 90 days old. What we did add also in the current liquidity was the net amount of due to other governments and due from other governments. And so Those, again, are the amounts of supplemental receivables from the state government as well as the federal government for those additional programs that support VMC. And we did net those because those are ins and outs, but it does net to a positive amount for 19 and 20, where the federal and state governments owe the county more than maybe what's estimated that's owed back. Looking at the quick ratio, the yellow line item, you compare the liquid assets to the current liabilities. And right now, for 2020, it's estimating that VMC has $1.01 for every dollar of current liabilities that are due. And so that liquidity is good. So the number of 1 or higher would be good. So there would be enough available assets to cover those obligations in the near term. So just to close out the discussion, sorry about that. So the cash advances from the general fund used to cover short-term cash flow or shortfalls resulting from the timing of AR collections. We will say that the AR collections, as Mr. Arturia mentioned before, is that there is some uncertainty around the timing of collections from the state and federal government. There has been a lag time that's been more than a year, but those estimated revenues have already been netted of any kind of, again, allowances or changes as legislation changes. Everything healthcare is reported prospectively in terms of those changes. So it is being monitored and adjusted appropriately, but is subject to audit as well as other reconciliations, because all of the public hospitals are linked to a lot of this funding. So everybody is subjected to various items. So yes, there is a lag in that collection. However, it is expected to be collected. And it's just the state determines that timing, and there is active participation by hospital and county management in terms of monitoring that timing. We did note that the cash flow and the in and out of the advance is monitored monthly by both the finance agency as well as VMC's management. And as of now, it appears that there's sufficient current assets or liquid assets to repay any kind of general fund cash advance, which right now the cap is sitting at about 300 million, but it's expected that that advance will be slightly less, about 240 million for the end of 2020. So that concludes my remarks, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I'm gonna, again, hold off on questions till we finish this section, if that's okay with my colleagues, and go to 6 and 7, if the staff just wants to touch on those before we go.
Yes, this is Greg Arturia, County Budget Director. And item number 6 is a request to receive the report relating to the fiscal year 2021 inventory items. These items were already approved by the board in June, and departments are working with county council on the grant agreements and working with the vendors, getting vendor numbers and everything they need to do to get those out the door. And we're expecting most of those agreements to be sent out and executed throughout this week. And then item number 7 is to receive a report from the administration regarding the off-agenda reports and responses to requests for information that we have received from the board during this budget process this summer. Each of those reports that have been submitted off agenda prior to this point or resubmitted again here on agenda for the benefit of all stakeholders following this. And then just as a reminder, as we get more referrals and requests for information from the board this week during the hearings, we will also be responding both off agenda when we have that information, And also on agenda at the morning or at the beginning of each session this week, we have a kind of a placeholder on the agenda, to tag and add any supplemental information that gets requested of the board this week. And that concludes my reports for items 6 and 7.
Great. So what we're going to do is we're going to take public comment, and then we're going to come to the board for this section. We have a couple of speakers under public comment. I'll ask the clerk to call on our public speakers.
President Chavez, how much time would you like us to give?
1 minute.
Wonderful, thank you. Our first speaker is Sparky Harlan. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you will have 1 minute to speak. The timer will begin when you begin speaking.
Sparky? Oh, Sparky, you might have muted yourself. Take yourself off mute. There you go.
Am I here?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. I'm speaking to an item that Supervisor Wasserman brought up at the beginning on how to testify and take public testimony on each of these budget items for the following week. I would request that you not take public testimony at the beginning of a whole group of items. For example, if I need to speak to behavioral health and probation, it could be 4 hours later that you hear about probation. So I would suggest if you don't want to hear public testimony on every number from 1 to 100, you at least do it by departments. So you could get behavioral health, probation, health and hospital, but at least allow us public testimony by category and department, if not by number. Thank you.
Sparky, I normally don't respond to public comment, but I think that was actually exactly his recommendation. So, all right, next.
Our next speaker is SVCN. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you will have 1 minute to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Good afternoon, supervisors. This is Wendy Ho with the Silicon Valley Council of Nonprofits, and we've partnered with the Behavioral Health Contractors Association for purposes of our advocacy this week. We appreciate the county's acknowledgement of the essential role CBOs play in serving the community as partners in the county safety net. As partners, we understand that we must also share in the pain. And given the budget deficit the county is facing, we recognize tough choices must be made to keep the county solvent. But CBO partners must be part of the conversation on solutions. To that end, we respectfully request that budget-related communications be issued to CBOs in a timely and transparent manner so that we can plan adequately and ensure continuity of services. In that vein, we were disappointed to see a number of CBO contracts in DFCS that are being recommended for termination or right-sizing on Wednesday's agenda. To our knowledge, none of those providers whose contracts are on the line were notified by the department about these pending changes. They don't know how much their contracts are being cut or when these changes will be slated to take effect. We must do better. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Gregory Kepferly. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you will have 1 minute to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Thank you, President Chavez and members of the board. This is Greg Kepferly, CEO of Catholic Charities, a member of SVCN and BHCA. As SVCN and BHCA, we really encourage the commitment of the board to maintain especially safety net services, to preserve those services to the most vulnerable members of our community. I know there's tough budget decisions now, and there will be some going forward on an ongoing basis. Priority must be made to preserving safety net and to ensuring those diverse communities who are struggling the most have the most protection. As Supervisor Simidian said at a previous meeting, the county's responsibility is to care for the least of these among us, and I appreciate that perspective. Thank you.
Our next speaker is John White. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you will have 1 minute to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, supervisors. This is John White from Abode Services. We're one of the county's partners in providing homeless services to people experiencing homelessness across the area, but in particularly Santa Clara County. We're currently one of the main COVID hotel operating partner that the county has. And I just wanted to applaud the Board of Supervisors for the tough choices that they have to make right now. And I echo some of the earlier comments that the nonprofits are key to solving the various social challenges that we have and providing that crucial safety net for our most vulnerable residents. So I would just encourage the cuts to be made to other components that are not life-threatening. Cuts to social service and safety net programs could result in people dying. And so we just thank you for your priorities in serving our county.
Our next speaker is Alyssa Koff-Ginsburg. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you will have 1 minute to speak. The timer will begin when you start speaking.
Good afternoon. Lisa Koff-Ginsburg speaking today as part of the SVCN BHCA coalition. Our county's services rely on community-based providers on the front line. This unique perspective is important to minimize the harm of upcoming unprecedented budget reductions. We call on the county executive's office and all departments to work together with skilled partners to craft shared strategies and solutions throughout this ongoing process. We understand these are unusual budget times and information on the magnitude of revenue is continually shifting. However, these circumstances still.
Elisa, we're having a hard time hearing you.
We understand these are unusual budget times and information on the magnitude of revenue is continually shifting. However, under these circumstances, it's possible for the department to meet and identify strategies to prepare contingencies for the short time frame for making final decisions.
During the situation, she is a little bit of Lead Man had a hard time getting a hold of her. She's a little.
Our next speaker is Aaron O'Brien. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you will have 1 minute to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Aaron O'Brien speaking here today along with my colleagues from the SVCN and BHCA Coalition. First, I want to thank you for your efforts in these unprecedented and incredibly challenging times. I hope you have felt the spirit of partnership that the CBO community has brought to the county-wide and community-deep responses to COVID. It is in that same spirit of partnership that we are here today, seeking to collectively inform and advance the best possible budget solutions in these economically harrowing times. Building on my colleagues' comments, we ask that within the iterative budget processes that you adopt the following. Be transparent with the community about the relevant details of the budget, historical revenue and expense trends, and the choices to be made. It is difficult for the community to engage in the budget conversations without the relevant data. Over time, the county's public budget documents have become increasingly opaque and difficult to access, and having easy to understand docs in a centralized repository will make it much more accessible for everyone. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Susie Rivera. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you will have 1 minute to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Hello, Board of Supervisors. I'm Susie Rivera from Fresh Lifeline for Youth, and I am a member of the Silicon Valley Council nonprofit BHCA Coalition. It is extremely important to continue to create opportunities for meaningful public engagement on the budget, ensuring that all voices of those who are directly impacted in our community are centered, heard, and considered in all decisions. Using time-tested as well as create strategies, include flexible technology options to center community voices, is very critical right now. And strongly urge Board of Supervisors to be intentional as well as mindful in its community engagement efforts regarding the county budget, particularly as decisions on core safety net programs and services will be a part of the county's quarterly budget reviews. At the minimum, county should use a network of community organization partners to outreach to impacted communities, and direct outreach to other elected officials, neighborhood associations, schools, commerce, and the media should also be included in the community engagement plan. Translation and interpretation services should be made available, and approaches that are sensitive to the digital divide should be in place in the state of our nation.
Our next speaker is Scott Largent. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you will have 1 minute to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Scott Largent. How about just a suggestion? We budget for, and what is Scotty going to say? Water. Can we figure that out? Can we tie that into some department, somebody's budget? Maybe people want to donate water. The water is still shut off at all the parks. Okay. Maybe some of you supervisors would like to donate some water. Maybe you'd like to throw it in your SUV and drop it off at the park. Mike Wasserman, you're a really nice guy. Maybe you could go buy, maybe 20 big bags of ice and drop it off over there. Start unloading that water. I'll help you get it out of the car. Dave, you're a good man too. Why don't we fill up your truck and we'll bring it over there to that park and start helping these people? These are small things, guys, but what I saw yesterday out there, I don't know. This doesn't even happen in third world countries. So please wake up and look out your window. Thank you.
Thank you. We have no other public comment on this section. I'm going to go from left to right, and I'm going to start with Dave and see if he has any questions on this section. I don't see Dave. How about Susan?
Thank you. I do have some comments on and questions on 4 and 5, but I want to just first take a very quick second to acknowledge that that there's been a hunger strike in the jail since August 14th, and I don't believe that the board has received any information or update regarding the status of that strike, the health of the inmates who are participating in it, and I'd like administration to work with the Office of the Sheriff to review the demands made by the inmates and advocates and provide an off-agenda report to the board prior to the public safety budget hearings with an analysis of demands that are in alignment with the board's budget priorities, please. And with that said, I'd like to thank all of the presenters for the work that you have all done in working to find cuts that minimize the impact to services. As I laid out last week, I have 3 priorities for this budget: fully funding the COVID response, supporting our vulnerable populations, and investing in the county's operational capacity so we can successfully do the first 2. And looking at this budget overall, I'm not confident that we have fully funded the COVID-19 response. And I'll explain using a couple of examples. Administration, this is all regarding item 4 right now. Administration is recommending just $50 million for the COVID reserve, plus whatever CARES funding may be available. Based on administration's analysis in the expenditure plan and revenues, that number should be closer to $90 million. We're still only dedicating $12 million to paid contact tracers. And according to item 7D, this is standing in the way of improving our contact tracing outcomes. I was concerned by an article yesterday in the Merc that indicates that we have only 60 Spanish-speaking tracers. We need to get the right people in these critical roles, and we need to seriously consider whether we need to be paying to get people with the right skills and background into these roles. I don't see anywhere in the budget supports for small businesses, again, many of which are sole proprietorships and women or minority owned and have been the hardest hit by COVID and the shelter in place. I've heard my colleagues say that their priorities are for the county to do what only the county can do, and that they care about making sure that we spend every dollar wisely, because $1 spent ineffectively is one that could have gone to a better use. Clearly, public health is something only the county can do. And this year, I really don't think there's any better or more equitable use for our dollars than restoring our communities and doing everything we can to stop the spread of COVID-19, especially in our vulnerable communities on the east side of San Jose and in South County. So my question to administration is, what trade-offs would we need to make in order to double the size of the COVID reserve?
Let me try to answer this. We're very aware of the board's desire to put more money into the COVID reserve. So we tried to come up with an amount that we were confident we wouldn't need to spend before November, knowing that we're going to have further reductions in November, because the only way that we could come up with another 40 or 50 million would be to actually cut into services. So we fully intend to put that money into it, but are anticipating to do it in an iterative way.
And you are confident that we have sufficient funds to ramp up our response as much as we need to between now and November?
Yes.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. Let me ask, I'm going to shift now to item number 5 and start by thanking Cheryl and your team for the analysis and for helping us as a board with suggestions to address the county's deficit. And here I have a few questions for John Mills. John, are you on? I'm looking at my list. Is John here? I do not see him. He sent an off-agenda report to all of the supervisors just an hour or so before the meeting in response to. Hey there.
I'm here.
Great.
Supervisor Ellenberg. Sorry, I was looking for the unmute button.
No worries. The report back on hires and separations that you shared with us this morning, and first of all, thank you so much for putting that together on relatively quick notice. It shows that in a given year, the county could expect to hire between 1,900 and 2,000 coded employees and lose between 1,300 and 1,600. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And do you think the county will be able to backfill over 1,300 coded employees and hire an additional 2,262 coded employees in the next fiscal year?
Yes, I mean, from ESA's perspective, yes, we would be able to process those transactions.
Not from the budget perspective.
Excuse me, Jeff?
Not from the budget perspective.
Well, so that's that's the critical point that I want to make here. I would like to direct administration to defund all currently vacant positions that will not be filled in this fiscal year. And I understand that defunding positions doesn't preclude them from being deleted later if necessary, but defunding those positions now allows the funds to be reallocated in a transparent way, including to the COVID-19 reserve. Is this a direction in which we can go?
Let me make sure I'm understanding. Before when Friday comes along, you'll have 440 vacant funded positions to delete. And
Defund as opposed to delete the positions entirely.
Defunding the position while leaving the position in place is a problem.
Oh, well, I'm happy to hear why that is. I thought it was simpler because my thought was in better times, we wouldn't be having to get board approval to recreate the codes and positions and get authorization now help me understand what's complicated about defunding but hanging on to them?
Well, because even if a position is defunded, it can still be filled by the department using fund balance. And if that happens, that's a long-term commitment of having a person in a filled position that needs to be funded in the future.
If we have a hiring freeze, would that address, if there's a hiring freeze, would that address the concern?
A hard hiring freeze would, but that causes its own problems because there are certain classifications where we need to keep hiring, for example, nurses, and there are a number of other classifications where we need to keep hiring. So there used to be a unfunded position pool at VMC, which was partially responsible for blowing up the budget on a regular basis because of the ability to use fund balance and the fluctuation of reimbursement. I could maybe ask Gary Graves to give you a little bit of history on that if you'd like. Gary?
Well, excuse me, I know that our time is very compressed today. I was hoping not to ask for any off-agenda reports, but it looks like if we're talking about Gary giving history, that maybe that's something that needs to come back to the board, a report with the analysis of which position, well.
Supervisor Ellenberg, may I recommend that,
please.
Especially given that I think this would actually be important for all of the board. So let's go ahead and let Gary respond to it.
Okay.
And I recognize
Great.
this is
Thank you.
but let me just make one point to my colleagues. We did something we have not done since I've been here in June, and that is that we passed, even if it was an operating budget, no matter what we want to call it, we passed that budget with almost no hearings, in part because we were setting this time aside so that you could all dive into it. So let's dive in. These are big decisions, and
okay, good. I appreciate that.
These lay the foundations for the next two budgets that we're going to be talking about in short order. So if I almost said Supervisor Grave, Gary, if you could weigh in.
Yeah, I appreciate that, by the way. This is my preference. I was trying to be respectful of the time, but thank you very much, Gary. Go right ahead.
I'll try to be as brief as I can. And actually, I don't have a whole lot to add to what Jeff is saying. I mean, the issue simply is that in the past, we've always encouraged the board to really have the discipline to delete positions. You know, when we have an ongoing or structural deficit, when you attempt to simply defund, it creates lots of potential confusion. And as he indicated in the past, we've had several times where departments have been able to fill positions that were not funded and created budget issues. And so that's something that over the course of time, we've always tried to avoid.
All right.
And we don't really believe that, you know, the adding back of positions is that big of a process. Obviously, I think you're looking at an extended period of financial distress. I think I would encourage you to really consider having the discipline to delete the positions. And then if in fact, at some point in the future, you want to add them back, you do that.
It actually, all things being equal, would be my preference then to delete them. I had thought that made the process much more complicated. But if that's in fact the recommended direction here, then I would support that and request that the unfilled positions be deleted.
There's only one other thing, if I could just add. I mean, obviously the administration is recommending deleting specific positions, specific vacant positions. Clearly, departments need some flexibility that they get from salary savings, in some cases for overtime, some cases for temporary help, some cases just to be able to function in terms of delivering services. So I would just, you know, offer some caution in terms of just wholesale deleting of vacant positions.
Sure. Let me be more clear then. I understand that the budget's already deleting 400 and something positions. I'm asking that we delete the positions in addition that we're not planning to fill this year.
Okay.
Not all of them. Is that more clear?
Yes.
Okay. And does that cause any significant worry or concern?
Well, I'd have to defer to Dr. Smith.
We'll go back and look between now and Friday. I think we did a fairly comprehensive look at vacant funded positions that we thought departments could do without, but we'll look and see if there are more. And if there are, we'll be ready on Friday. If not, we'll save that up until November, because as you point out, we also have a number of retirements and separations for various other reasons that happen every month. So the position count is a dynamic thing that changes from day to day. And I expect that at least we'll be coming back in November with more deletions.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate the feedback on both of those items, and I don't have any additional questions on 4, 5, 6, or 7.
Susan, were you done?
Indeed, I'm done with 4, 5, 6, and 7.
Thank you very much. Dave, I'm sorry I skipped you. I'm coming back to you.
No, it's all right. I was having trouble getting click going here to get back on when you called upon me. So I have a question, kind of a double question for Greg, just about the total numbers. And then I have a question for Dr. Smith about minimal impact on county operations. So, which is just a statement under solutions on packet page 16 or slide number 3 of the presentation, Dr. Smith. So I'm going to come back to that, but to Greg, so I just want to make sure I'm understanding the numbers overall. You talked about, or you showed us 144 million in reductions recommended by the county executive after adjustments to the departmental give and take. That 144 million you talked about coming back, or maybe Dr. Smith did, in September and then in February to see how that's going. But Greg, in your presentation, you also talked about, and I think I heard this clearly, but if I didn't, of course, you just correct me and we're done. That on top of the 144, we still have 300 million in essentially in deficit that needs to be made up, presumably with one-time money or further cuts somewhere down the line. What I'm really getting at is the total at this moment then the 300 plus the 144 in terms of what you're looking at for this fiscal year as either proposed to be cut or will be needed to, if you add together proposed to be cut on the slide of 144 million with what you see going forward for this fiscal year, are we at 444, not 144 in terms of what ultimately needs to be dealt with?
Yeah, Supervisor Cardizzi, through President Chavez. Yeah, the 140 in total savings from some reductions kind of solves 2 issues. One is we do have a decline in our estimated revenue, roughly 40 million, as mentioned. So of that 140 in savings, about 40 of it is just to make up for decline for downward revisions of our estimated revenue. And that gives us about 100 million net new ongoing savings from those reductions. And that net new ongoing savings is structural, 100 million a year, because these are ongoing costs. And so that does improve the overall structural deficit that, we going into this, we estimated would be at least 300 million per year structural deficit. Now, if the board agrees to these revised recommended reductions, that can improve to, instead of at least 300 million, improves to at least 200 million. And so it does mean we still have a structural deficit. even if the board agrees to all of these reductions of at least 200 million, could be more. We've talked about the different things that can make it bigger, but at least 200 million. So
Okay.
in my mind, this gets us a third of the way there of what we really need to focus on this year, knowing that we need to come back in November, do some more, whether it's another third or approximately that, it'll be up to the board, and then we'll still have the last third to go that we'll have to take a look at a little later, certainly by the time we're starting the next fiscal year, because we won't have these one-time solutions next fiscal year because we're using them up, so to speak.
Right. Okay, I understand. And as we get through the year, the further we are into the year, the more difficult it is to make cuts or adjustments during this fiscal year with the same magnitude that we would have at the beginning of the year, just because we have less months to go as we move on to save money with. But it sounds like I thought you said 144 and another 300. Sounds like I misheard you, and you're saying besides the 144 before us on your slide, there's perhaps another 200, not 300, that we're going to have to contend with in terms of structural deficit for this year, or that's being recognized this year.
I should have made that clear. The 300 is what we started with back in June. So having the savings with this action from the board on Friday decreases that 300 to somewhere in the 200 plus or minus, depending on everything that's going on. But it decreases it roughly by a third, and means that you're right, when we come to November and then ultimately to February, if we still have projected deficits in the 200 million or more range, we'll have to do deeper cuts.
Okay, I understand the numbers, the basic numbers, or the basic premise at this point, which is all I need for today, I think, because we're still in the overview. I just wanted to wrap my mind around what the totals, look like, and you just answered that. Now, this is really going, page 3 of the slides is, I think, kind of, let's call it a little more philosophical side of things, less numerical. But one of the bullets there says reduction of expenses with minimal impact on county operations. That is that phrase strikes me as a little bit of a red flag from a policymaker standpoint, because as we've gone through the overview, I haven't heard any real specificity, and nor would we normally over the past 11 years that I've been here, 11 previous budgets, but I haven't heard much specificity as to who and how and what was decided to be minimal impact on county operations. And I'm concerned about that. And I've only flagged one issue where I have a very specific concern. I think actually Supervisor Wasserman and I did, a very specific concern about some sheriff operations in rural areas that seem to be proposed for cut. And I'm using that as an example. We'll talk about that, I think, tomorrow. So I'm not looking for a response on that item. But as by way of example, when a board member or two ask a question like, isn't this a problem? Aren't we marginalizing a community? And I think that's sort of fundamentally the Oxford Dictionary definition of marginalizing, sort of minimizing or understating impact, to a group or an individual or a cohort of people, treating them as if they're on the periphery. And I worry about that in the overall budget. Now, not to say that I doubt for a minute that anyone's cavalier or that anyone sat down and just, took lightly what the impact would be to any communities within, this broad framework of who we serve as a county on the service delivery side. In fact, I'm quite sure there's been a lot of angst in every department and agency in the county trying to recommend cuts without marginalizing or, you know, having anything more than minimal impact. But what I'm really asking is, how do we, when do those tough discussions surface before us? It seems to me that the Board of Supervisors' job should perhaps be a little bit less about, is this the exact right amount, you know, in this department, or is this position really unfunded? That's your job, Dr. Smith, and your entire management team. I never doubt for a minute when you say we have, you know, X amount of unfunded positions or X amount of FTE, that's really the correct number. So it's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is, as people went through the policy-ridden decision of what do we do? We have a tough choice here. We've been asked to cut $10 million or $8 million or $6 million or $20 million. Where are we going to get it from? And who chooses between whether this group is impacted or this other group is impacted? I don't see that surfacing yet. And I know if we all become sort of genius level students on FTE over the next 3 or 4 days, we could dive real deep and try to figure out, you know, inherently where some of that occurred. But in terms of the overview, I'm not hearing how priorities were laid out. How did we avoid marginalizing communities for those of us who are really interested, those of us on the board, in making sure we don't exacerbate marginalization of overrepresented communities in areas of poverty or areas of you know, stress around immigration, or areas around COVID relief, as one of my colleagues indicated, or areas about like public safety in rural areas. How do we surface that over the next few days so that when we vote, I know that we adopted a budget that is aligned with my values in terms of who's impacted and who isn't.
Let me try to address that. First of all, the details of the impacts will come with each discussion of each department. But as I stated, what we tried to do is get proposals from the department heads, which they thought would not negatively impact services or where they could make readjustments. And certain departments did not provide us with adequate reductions. So we focused on funded, unfilled positions, taking the position that if there was nobody currently in the position, that the service that's currently being provided would continue to be provided. And now, as you know, we always have the issue of 3 independently elected public officials who have the authority themselves to decide where they're going to provide services and how those services are going to be provided. Nobody has told me from the Sheriff's Department that they intend to defund the patrol that you're talking about. And never was that considered to be an issue. And there are no positions on the cut list that are dedicated to that service. So we'll have to ask the sheriff a serious question about why that rumor got started.
Right, and thank you. And just in a sense, pivoting off that example, but just again, zooming out a little bit, same question. if we were to take, let me back up. When you were describing the overall recommendations in terms of cuts, FTE type cuts, again, you've been emphasizing that most, I think that was the exact word used, most of the unfunded, most of the position cuts were funded vacant positions. But of course, I'm drawing the inference from that some of them weren't. I didn't know if the Sheriff Patrol was in that category or not, but just if it was, it could be that kind of an example. It was also described that in some cases, a position, rather than be cut, would be moved somewhere else. And I guess all I'm trying to say here is it seems to me at that point, not on cutting, not on doing something like cutting funded vacant positions, but on moving around funded positions. Now we're getting into policy, policy issues that I need to better understand as we go along. So perhaps to try to be constructive about this, maybe there's a report you can give us somewhere along the line before we wrap this all up on the 21st, maybe on the 19th, I don't know. But if on your spreadsheets, you can isolate positions that in aggregate, positions that were not vacant, but have been impacted in some way by this budget recommendation, whether it's because the position was moved or for any other reason. It would be helpful to me to see that column or that spreadsheet, that sort of sub spreadsheet. I'm more interested in those than I am in the funded vacants. The funded vacants, if you say there's X amount and this is what we're doing with them, I'm good. Well, one board member. The ones that are funded that are moving around, I think I feel like I need to pay close attention to what the policy implications are on those. So would it be possible, and maybe it's more of a question for Greg, to sort of slide those over on a one-pager or a two-pager or a three-pager and give that to us as a supplemental and show us where the movement is in those areas?
Yes, we're working on that right now. We've got a draft which we knew you would want, but we had to do some extra work on it to make sure we had everything exactly correct in terms of where they were being moved to. But in the Sheriff's Department, just to be specific, those positions were not moved to a different location. There were no cuts. The positions that are funded that were deleted and are based on what the department head felt was a appropriate reassignment and happened mostly in probation, but some other departments, and it ends up being a relatively small total number. But we definitely will be giving the board that total spreadsheet once we're sure that it's absolutely correct.
Okay, thank you, President Chavez. Thank you, Dr. Smith and Mr. Turia. I'm sorry about my plotting approach, but that was where I was trying to get to, and I'm happy to hear that we're getting that information. Thank you.
You bet. Thanks, Dave. Supervisor Simidian?
Thank you, Madam.
Joe, you're muted. There you go.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm ready to offer motions when the time is right, but I don't want to deter either Supervisor Wasserman or you from comments or questions. When would you like me to offer motions, Madam Chair?
If we could, at the end of each of our exploration, when we're done with this section of questions.
Good, then I'll pass for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Supervisor Wasserman?
Thank you, and I'll get mine done and under the time limit here. I'll just go down my list. I said I want to say I agree with Gary and Jeff It's a mess to have unfunded vacant positions. I'm glad that we got to that point. Number two, we need to get off of the state's watch list. People that can work don't need as much help. That's what came into mind when I heard Supervisor Ellenberg speaking about the services, the aid, the COVID dollars that we need. At the end of the day, if people can work, they're much more able and capable of providing for themselves. So whatever we need to do to get off that state's watch list is just paramount to me. I want to thank Greg and Cheryl for their budget passion. I've been doing this for 10 years, and this was the spunkiest reports that I've read going back and forth. You each come at it from a different perspective. I'm glad you're both there approaching it, and I think between the two of you that we have gotten to a very good place. I would say that the issue we're facing now is trying to come up with a definite plan, which I think you have done, to deal with an unknown future of revenue and expenses. And I know every 60 days or so that we meet going forward, some of our estimates will be spot on, some of them are going to be way off, but that's the way we've got to do this. There is no alternative. There are too many issues out of our control. So I thank all of you that have put together what's before us today. And I'll close through the chair if I may to Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith, you made a comment earlier today about federal reimbursement requirements are strange. We're not getting all the money back that's COVID related because the Fed's requirements for reimbursement. It doesn't surprise me at all that they make no sense, that they're illogical, that they're not consistent, that they're constantly changing. Reminds me of both the federal government and some days how I feel about the state. But doctor, is there any way that you can recommend we can do more or change so as to comply with the federal requirements for reimbursement? I flash back on our hospital computer system before we changed to our current one. And you said the shortcomings of our current system was that it didn't enable us to bill for as much reimbursement for hospital services as the new system could. And I wondered if there was something possible here that we could do that would be cost effective, where we could increase the odds of our getting reimbursement with the current federal parameters. Thank you, Madam Chair. That's it for me. I just want to hear Dr. Smith's response.
Thank you for the question. Great question. As the board knows, there are two basic, quote, pots of money that the feds are talking about. One is FEMA, which is merely related to the emergency status of the pandemic, and historically is very limited to services and materials that are specifically related to the response, and it requires keeping track of all of the records, which we do, and filing a report at periodic time periods, which we do, and then they review it and typically take quite a long time to review it, and oftentimes will challenge and audit the response. So we're, very much on top of that. We have an outside team of accountants who specialize in FEMA response reimbursement, and they're working on everything quite vigorously on a constant basis. So that's a good thing, but we can't really predict exactly how much money that will be because it takes such a long process and the feds are so sticky about it. And particularly since this emergency isn't like a flood or earthquake or hurricane, it doesn't have specific seeable damage. It's going to be interesting to see how what approach they take. In terms of the so-called CARES Act money, which now is, I guess, 5 different acts, not all called CARES, but I'll just shorthand it. Each of those has different rules and regulations about what it can be used for. and we're keeping track of that. The money comes in aliquots. We have 150 roughly now, getting up, as Greg said, to 180 that's already committed, and expecting more with the HEROES Act. And that's a matter of keeping track of the same data and also charging, or not charging, keeping records of whether it meets their criteria or not. So I think that's a great question, and we're working on it, and we got the outside help that we need.
Thank you. Thank you to my colleagues. I have a few questions that I would like to ask. And first, I wanted to thank the staff for having MGO take a look at the cash issues relative to Santa Clara Valley Medical Center. And I wanted to ask if we could go to page 15 of the presentation, and it says results of evaluation. And there are two questions that I have. One is that I'm looking at the years at the bottom. It says we have 19% from 2019 that hasn't been billed yet, and then for 2020 we have another 27% that have not yet been billed for. And I'm wondering if there's a concern from the staff about those numbers, how that looks relative to, you know, whatever the standard is for healthcare systems to be able to get reimbursed for.
Yeah, this is Gregory Tria. You're speaking to the current patient accounts receivable. I see those that where the services have been provided within 30 days. And what that's capturing is the services within the last 30 days, knowing that they send these billing cycles out on a monthly basis. You're catching it, I think, a moment in time. I don't know if
I mean, the problem with that is that this is for fiscal year 2019, so that wouldn't be, I mean, that would be 30 days plus, maybe a little bit longer. What I'm really trying to understand is that what's the implications of this? And that's really what I'm not sure I entirely understand based on the whole presentation. And I see that Linda Hurley's on. Greg, would you like her to respond to that?
Yes,
Thank
please.
Yes. So yeah, we did include the unbilled in this unbucketed, this bucketed of 0 to 30 days, and as Greg had mentioned, those are the bills that had not gone out yet, and there is approximately a 30-day billing cycle. What we've seen is that VMC appears to be current on their patient billing cycle. So yes, these may be a little bit longer than the 30 days because they are in the next billing cycle. And I guess what we could have done here is split those out and just show you, in this bullet what those amounts are. But if you went to the next page, you could see that the 0 to 30 days, for the 19 it is a little bit skewed because you've got the purchases in there of O'Connor as well as St. Louis, but 2020, that chart looks a little, it looks more normal. So about 33% is in the 0 to 30 days and about 27% of the total AR is unbilled. It's waiting to be billed. It's not that there's necessarily issues with it getting billed, it's just within the current billing cycle. And so I would really point you toward those later buckets, and that, they are relatively small compared to the entire AR balance. And that means that VMC is getting their bills out on time and they are collecting appropriately.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And the that they're billing on time and they're billing appropriately, that's indicated. Your point is that's indicated on page 16. If I wanted.
Correct. Yeah. if you're looking at the 91 days and beyond, those are very small portions of the entire AR.
And the industry practice is what?
You know, I would say that this is probably normal to the industry practice. You're going to have some hospitals that are struggling getting billed.
That is if I'm, Linda, that's if I'm looking at 2020?
Correct, yes.
Versus
yes.
2019?
Yeah,
Okay.
I would say 2020 is a normal depiction. There were some delays in the O'Connor and the St. Louis billing as VMC brought them online to their operations, but they have been caught current. And 2020 includes those new operations that were purchased in 19.
You mean the 2 hospitals?
Correct. It's all 3. It's VMC, it's O'Connor, and St. Louis.
So St. Louis.
Or St. Louis.
That's okay. So for fiscal year 2019, that was not inclusive of all 3 hospitals?
It does include all 3 hospitals, but it's the 2 purchased hospitals with that AR is all in that orange pie. And so that's why it's very skewed. And
okay, so let me ask a different question, Linda. So as I look at the, and I know you skipped over portions of this report. So if it's in here, you can point me to another page, no problem. But what I'm trying to understand is for a hospital, for the health and hospital system that we have, the normal, the normal float that we would be investing in our health and hospital system, separate of the subsidy, but the normal cash, or not normal, but the loan from the general fund, I guess is the best way to describe it. That number should be around what in the long term? What should that amount be based on what you've learned about our healthcare system?
You know, I think that is really going to depend on the timing of those, the collection of the AR. I mean, right now, that amount seems to be appropriate at about the $300 million mark. At the end of 19, you were about half of that. But looking as these revenue streams are being accumulated and some of the timing issues with the state, and we see timing issues across the state in the various hospitals.
Yes.
But to each hospital, it's a little bit different in terms of that participation. But
for our three hospitals, based on their size, you're comfortable with 300 million, not needing to exceed 300 million, and ongoing, you believe we will need 300 million or something approximate to that?
Until the timing catches up, what the monthly cash flows have shown, and we looked at it historically, you know, all the way through on a month-to-month basis through 2020, that 300 million seemed appropriate. And you've ended 2020 just slightly under that, but it is an actively managed process. And we did see the spikes in inflows of cash, as well as some of those drops on the inflows as we looked at the net cash flows of everything coming in outside and then everything having to go out in a given period of time.
All right, thank you very much. So back to the issue around staffing, let me just say what I'm most concerned about. We're gonna, and this really is, I think, directed to Dr. Smith. What I'm concerned about is that we're going to ask departments, and to that matter, our nonprofit partners, but departments in particular, to have a significant change in their budgets, and in some instances, dramatic changes. And my concern is that if we use the current method for deleting codes, that we don't build in the flexibility we want departments to have. And I heard what Mr. Graves said about, you know, having the discipline to delete the code. And I don't think this is a matter of discipline. I think that the board and I won't speak for everybody except in this one way, I think we understand that the budget is devastating. But I feel like we're using an old-fashioned tool to address this process. And what feels old-fashioned to me about it is that if we're going to be deleting, 20 or 30% of a budget, not giving the departments the flexibility to live within a budget is a concern of mine. And the point that you raise about not allowing people to hire, I don't disagree. I don't think you should, make rules about not hiring with your fund balance or object to that would in fact require a process. But it appears to me that it would make much more sense to freeze the positions so that if somebody retires that's in position X, but you want to be able to bring back position Y because it has a function you need, that you should have the flexibility to do that within your department. And so anyway, I feel like we're using an old tool for a very dramatically new situation.
Do you want me to respond?
Yes, if you have something maybe I don't understand about the approach.
Well, it's a pretty typical tool that everybody uses to eliminate positions rather than just to decrease the funding. And one of the big reasons for that is because departments don't have any control over the cost of an FTE. The board controls that through the negotiation process and deciding what the costs are going to be. So the only real thing that a department head can do to deal with their costs is reassignments or losing positions. And so if you just defund the positions, basically you're not really guaranteeing that you're going to save the money. Plus, if you do that and a hard freeze, there's really no difference between that and coming back to the board to create a new position. That's the standard approach to it. And the departments have considerable flexibility of reassigning positions to different budget units too. So that if they have, say, a clerk and they want them to do a different job, they can reassign them to the different job. I guess that's the best I can say.
And President Chavez, this is Greg. I could add a couple other, I think, worthy considerations as well. And first, regarding flexibility for departments, we work in the Office of Budget and Analysis. We work closely with departments as you mentioned, what happens if a vacancy comes up or retirement comes up through what we call the add delete process, where a department might come back and say, this position was deleted, recently, because of a budget solution. Now I've got this retirement or impending retirement. We would like to be able to look to swap those out so we can have the flexibility, continue to meet our core client needs and our core service needs. And if the add delete looks like it's really kind of in the same area of service, it's the same type of thing, we do that administrative add delete and we report back on the board. If it looks like it has a policy implication, it's changing really one part of the operations to another, we like to bring that to the Board of Supervisors and ask the board to contemplate doing this add delete. So I think there are some inherent flexibility still remaining, even if we go and do deletes, knowing that there's going to be turnover in different parts of the organization. And then the second point is regarding our need to manage the different funding sources. If you recall from the overview earlier of our nearly $8 billion in revenue, only about 1.6, 1.7 million of it that's discretionary. And that's where our big budget deficit is right now on that part of it. And then we have a lot of positions that are funded with outside funding sources, the vast majority of them.
Yeah,
and so we use these tools to help with that as well.
Yeah, and here's what I think. First of all, I think you all need greater tools. There's a lot you don't know about the budget. I mean, what I mean by that is just, you know, your object two and how much detail you have, and you don't have enough detail. And honestly, the 2 TSS investments, I think we should hurry up, is getting you the budget tools that you need so you really can track down to the gnat's eyebrow countywide. And then the other is finishing the jail management information system so that we can do a better job in that area. So I appreciate that there's a lot that gives you all more control. I have not been persuaded, and I think part of the reason for that is that if we had a bad spell with the hospital and the health system a while back, I think that just watching what the county hospital was able to do, as a matter of fact, give back more money and still give themselves flexibility. And I think they are the one department that has a little more flexibility than most other departments. I think we're asking people to do really, really difficult jobs and prioritize things relatively quickly. And I think that the idea that any of our processes are flexible, it's honest to God a word I haven't heard us use for any of our, anything relative to how we manage onboarding or changing or anything relative to staffing. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with my colleagues because I do think these unprecedented times give us an opportunity to learn how to manage and manage better, including our resources. And Greg, whatever it is that magic tools that you need, I hope that's on the TSS list since you're in charge of all of that. So with that, I want to just wrap up. And Greg, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I was at 15 minutes and I've been mean to everybody else about it. So with that, I'm going to go back to Supervisor Simidian, who would like to make a motion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to sort of tee up what I thought might help us move along in the budget process today is item number 4, which we have heard the presentation on, requires only recommended action is that we receive the information. So in a moment, I will make a motion that we simply receive the report on item number 4. Item number 5, which is the material we have on the Harvey Rose recommendations, as I think about it, and I understand all of us sort of sort this stuff out somewhat differently, but as I think about it, there was a somewhat unusual narrative section with what I counted as 11 recommendations, sort of for longer term consideration, and I have some thoughts about how we might process those. So I'll offer a motion on those in a minute that is distinct and separate from the action that I think we really do have to slog through today, which is the 14 items where there are recommendations from Harvey Rose, and in some cases agreement, some cases disagreement, in some cases only partial agreement. So we need to sort of decide what we want to do on those items. And then that'll take us to 8, 9, 10, which are more general budget reference items before we get to 11 through 53, which I think are the ones that Supervisor Wasserman indicated he was prepared to make some motions on. So with your permission, Madam Chair, I'd like to simply go ahead and move the recommended action on item 4, which is to receive the report, and then I will make motions in connection with item number 5 if permitted. Thank you.
Wasserman, second.
Okay, so we're going to do a roll call vote on item 4. And I just wanted to say we were going to try to take them all together, but we can absolutely do that. So may I ask for a roll call vote?
Supervisor Ellenberg?
Yes.
Supervisor Simidian?
Aye.
Supervisor Cortese?
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman?
Aye.
President Chavez?
Yes, thank you. Supervisor Simidian, item 5?
Thank you. The reason, Madam Chair, that I didn't think we could do item 5 as part of a larger quasi-consent calendar is because there are, as I say, somewhat unusually, Ms. Solov referenced this in her presentation, some general countywide recommendations that are separate and apart from the 14 specific recommendations They can be found on packet pages 65 to 69. 65 to 69. If you look at the numbers that are there at first blush, it looks like there were only 9 items, but in fact, number 3 on packet page 65 has 2 recommendations, and on packet page 69, there's what I would characterize as a 5th recommendation under health and hospital, but it's not really numbered. It's just entitled long term. So that means there are 11 items there, and I am guessing that they are there because the recommendation, at least that's my understanding, is that we at some point would revisit these and think about what we did or didn't want to do with them. I think the most expeditious way to do that would be to take the 11 items and refer them to the appropriate committees. By my calculation, there are 4 that would appropriately go to FGOC, there are 5 that would appropriately go to Health and Hospital, and there are 2 that would go to Public Safety and Justice. So I will move that we refer those longer term recommendations on packet pages 65 to 69 to the appropriate committees. If there's a second, I'll explain just a little bit more specifically for the record which ones go where.
I'll second for discussion.
Thank you. Madam Chair and members, there are recommendations regarding reopeners in future labor agreements, regarding delays in implementing contract increases, regarding economic reopeners in future contracts, and modification of contracts to delay contractual rate increases in the current fiscal year. I believe that's contracts with all 4 of those would, in my judgment, appropriately be best in FGOC.
You're fading out, Supervisor.
You're cutting in and out. Sorry, Joe.
What I'll do is
That's good.
I'll get rid of my video and hope that that improves the quality. So there were 4 that were for FGOC. There are 5 that I think go to HHC. They are the reference to the $300 million quote advance to VMC that got some discussion today, the maximum general fund sourced annual monetary obligation for the hospital system's losses, the use of general fund monies for new hospital capital projects, the request that's recommended for the administration to prepare proposals for the board's consideration regarding transitioning some number of physician FTEs to non-physician practitioners, and the VMC cash advance resolution. All 5 of those could best be played out a little bit more at HHC. And then the 2 that seemed to me to be appropriate for public safety were civilianization recommendations and the number of institutional staff responsible for juvenile hall, the ranch, main jail, and Elmwood. So those are 11 items. They're all in the document. I think they're all worthy of discussion, whether I agree or disagree. And in some cases, I don't know yet my motion is to simply move those to the appropriate committees as indicated.
Supervisor Wasserman?
Thank you, Madam President. Just through the chair, please, to Dr. Smith. I seconded the motion. I just wanted confirmation that moving all those to the respective committees does not cause any sort of problem at all as far as funding or allocations or getting something approved. I just want confirmation of that. Dr. Smith.
Jeff? You're on mute.
It's a good idea to move them to committee for more discussion.
Wonderful.
I guess the only one thing that I would ask the board to clarify is there is the table that Shell referred to where there was the funding proposals with their proposal and our proposal.
Yep.
I'll get to that in a moment.
Oh, okay, good.
May I ask a procedural question before Supervisor Smithian goes on to the Harvey Rose piece? If the items are moved to the different committees, you're still talking about within the board hearing section that we will all hear. Correct. So if I have comments on TSS and FAF, for example, I will have the opportunity to make those then in the appropriate committees, or do that now?
I want to first distinguish, through the chair, if I may.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I want to distinguish the 11 that I've just referenced, which were not the 14 that are numbered with agree, disagree. The 11 I just referenced were all things that the Harvey Rose folks said, hey, you all should be thinking about these things. So I just wanted to make sure they didn't get lost. And I thought the way to do that was to send them to committee. But what I should have said, Supervisor Ellenberg, and I apologize, is that the committees would be asked to report back at our October 20th board meeting. That way we'll have some feedback before we go into the November exercise, and we'll be a little bit more informed, hopefully, at that point. So that's a standalone motion before I get to a motion on the 14 items, which is what Dr. Smith was wanting to make sure we didn't forget as well.
Got it. Thank you very much for that clarification.
And my question was that the October wouldn't be problematic. Thank you for that answer. Thank you, Madam President.
Great, thank you. So we have a motion and a second. Any more discussion on this motion? May I ask for a roll call vote? Oh, I'm sorry, I have one speaker on this item. Oh, no, wait, we took speakers already. Never mind. I apologize. Go ahead.
Supervisor Ellen, oh, excuse me.
Sorry, Nancy.
Supervisor Ellenberg.
Yes.
Supervisor Simidian.
Aye.
Supervisor Cortese.
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman.
Aye.
President Chavez.
Yes.
Next.
So Supervisor Simidian, to the second half of that item.
Thank you. So then the rest of that item is the 14 item grid. And Madam Chair, I know it's painful, but I think we can do it relatively expeditiously, although there may be questions. In each case, there's a recommendation. Some cases there's a disagree. Some cases a partially agree. I think on only 2 is there a full agreement. So I do think we need to go through and quickly do motions on each one. And I'm prepared to offer my thoughts, but I don't want to step in front of the line if somebody else would like to go next.
Joe, do you mind I've watched you do this Harvey Rose thing many times. So if you don't mind taking us through, it would be great.
Happy to do it. And I'll pause at each one briefly to make sure that I'm not moving us too expeditiously. Madam Chair, on item number 1, we have a recommendation from the Harvey Rose folks to, with respect to excess funding of vacant positions. They've pitched us for increasing the salary savings factor. The staff has come back and said, actually, we think addressing the elimination of positions is the better way to get the same result. I am inclined to support the staff recommendation and do now move so for item 1 on this list of 14 items.
Do we have a motion? Do we have a motion? Do we have a second? I'll second that motion.
And the chair, what page is this chart on again?
It's on packet page 110.
Thank you.
8 of 18.
Got it.
On the internal. And this is item 1.
Thank you. Then item, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion on this motion? Seeing none, what I'm going to ask is for a roll call vote.
Supervisor Ellenberg.
Yes.
Supervisor Simidian.
Aye.
Supervisor Cortese.
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman.
Aye.
President Chavez.
Yes, thank you. Joe?
Thank you, Madam Chair. On item number 2, the Rose organization is recommending that there be a $15 million loan essentially from the Valley Health Plan to the VMC Enterprise Fund, if approved by County Council, to reduce the general fund loan to VMC. This ties into the $300 million conversation that we're having. Staff has recommended against that. They've got to disagree. I am inclined in this case to say move the staff recommendation, which is to not take the recommendation, but refer the item to Health and Hospital for additional discussion with a report back on October 20th, along with the other items that I've referenced previously. That will allow us.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
No, forget that. That will allow us to look at it a little more carefully, and also we'll have a better sense by then whether or not it's a step that is, quote, necessary, end quote, by virtue of the judgment of the full board.
We have a motion. Do we have a second? I'll second that. We have a motion and a second. Any discussion on the motion? None. Roll call vote, please.
Supervisor Ellenberg,
Yes.
Supervisor Simidian,
Aye.
Supervisor Cortese,
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman,
Yes.
President Chavez.
Yes. Thank you.
On item number 3, regarding various fund balances available for borrowing for general fund cash flow, my reading of this, and I'll confirm with Ms. Soloff, is that this is essentially an information item at this point, that we can reconsider it at some point in the future. And if that's the case, then my motion would be to simply defer action on this item, if I can get a second, and a confirmation from Ms. Soloff.
Confirmed.
Thank you.
We have a motion from Supervisor Smitty and a second from Supervisor Wasserman. I don't know if this needs a roll call vote, but we'll take one anyway. Is that all right with everyone? Thank you, Nancy.
Supervisor Ellenberg,
Yes.
Supervisor Simidian,
Aye.
Supervisor Cortese,
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman,
Aye.
President Chavez.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. That takes us to item number 4, which is special programs and reserves. The Harvey Rose folks have identified 2 reserves and have suggested that the proposed purposes may not be realized in the current fiscal year, and that we might wish to divert those ongoing reserves. The staff has come back and said, no, actually, we think we will need some portion of those reserves this year. I am prepared to accept the staff's view for the time being, understanding that as the year progresses, we may have more information about both what our needs as a county are and what the need for these particular 2 reserves will be in the current fiscal year. Again, for that reason, move approval of the staff recommendation, which is to disagree for the time being with the Harvey Rose recommendation.
We have a motion. Do we have a second? I'll second it. You are, Mike, or are you going to ask a question?
Sure, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
No, Supervisor Wasserman seconds.
I'll second.
Any more discussion on the motion? Roll call vote.
Supervisor Ellenberg,
Yes.
Supervisor Simidian,
Aye.
Supervisor Cortese,
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman,
Aye.
President Chavez.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe that takes us to item number 5, facilities and fleet item. And basically, there's a debate here about how much savings there could be on fuel and tires. The administration partially agrees, and the Harvey Rose folks have said they thought we could achieve a savings of $794,000. The administration prefers a reduction of $365,462, and I'm prepared to move the staff recommendation. And as the folks from Harvey Rose said earlier, if you can get half the agreement, that's probably not a bad day's work. So move the staff recommendation on item number 5.
We have a motion.
Second that.
A second from
Second.
Supervisor Ellenberg.
Madam Chair, I have a question.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Is there any way to avoid 14 separate roll call votes going forward on this? Are there any that can be combined together?
I think we're going pretty speedy, and so I
Okay.
just want to say let's just keep rolling. Thanks.
Rolling.
All right, so we have a motion, we have a second. Any more discussion on the motion? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Supervisor Ellenberg,
Yes.
Supervisor Simidian,
Aye.
Supervisor Cortese,
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman,
Yes.
President Chavez.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Item 6.
Thank you. Here again, the administration partially agrees. This has to do with TSS, our Technology Services and Solutions. I'm going to take myself off the screen so I don't break up. And the recommendation is to reduce the overall one-time TSS budget by $26.5 million. The administration has come back to suggest a subset of the reductions, basically $13 million in specific categories. I am prepared to accept that recommendation and move approval of the staff recommendation, which again is about half of what was proposed.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Susan?
I have a question on this. I'm not ready to vote yet.
Yeah, go ahead. That's questions and comments now.
Great, thank you so much. Let me start. I want to ask just a couple of questions to Imre related to the management audit and administration's response. As Supervisor Simitian just said, Harvey Rose recommends decreasing the TSS one-time funded projects by 26.5 million. Will that cause critical projects to be defunded? And if the answer is yes, which projects would be defunded?
Supervisor Allenberg, this is Imre Kabai. No, it will not cause critical projects to be discontinued, but the projects will line up better with the realistic capacity of the project team or program team to deliver.
And regarding the administration's counter proposal to temporarily defund public safety and justice system projects, what would the impact be there by delaying or reducing that project funding?
If we take the whole reduction, $26 million, then many of those critical projects has to be discontinued.
So based on that, then I would prefer that we move forward with the Harvey Rose proposed 26 million reduction to one-time funded projects, not the 13 million reduction to public safety and justice projects funding.
Forgive me, I may have misheard. I thought that the response to the last question was that if the full 26 was cut, that would mean that there would be reductions or cuts that would stop important projects. Did I hear incorrectly? Forgive me, it was a little faint.
That's correct.
Can you repeat that then again?
That's correct. The $26 million defunding would force us to discontinue several critical projects in that program.
Can you give me an example?
For example, the jail management system and the modernization of the 911 core system.
And those are among. Okay, thank you.
So we have a motion and a second to take the staff's recommendation on the $13 million. And just to make sure I'm correct about this 13 million would be, if necessary, for a loan from that fund, not a permanent discontinuation of that fund. Cheryl, is that accurate?
Yes, this is accurate. So in following fiscal years, we are going to ask for that money to continue. In that portfolio, we have critical projects driven by compliance reasons, elimination of manual work, or refresh of critical infrastructure. So some of these projects are important and critical, and others are important. And those important but not as critical projects will need further funding.
Thank you. Cheryl, did you want to, because this, I didn't understand this to be a cut. I understood it to be a potential loan from this fund. Is that accurate, Cheryl?
No, Supervisor, it actually, so every year there's an allocation of a large amount of money for one-time projects directly from the general fund for TSS projects. And typically, there's 50 million or so that's carried over every year, or more or less. And so this would actually reduce that amount. Excuse me. It's not a loan.
Got it. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Claire, can I make a comment?
Sure.
I think Cheryl will agree with me. basically, this is the question of whether these monies will be spent in this fiscal year. And what Emre was saying was that if we do the 26 million, that will cause us during this fiscal year to fall behind on the public safety and justice system, which we're already numerous years behind for various reasons that the board knows about. The 13 million is a more reasonable perspective from our, or option from our perspective, because Cheryl is correct that we do tend to have some projects that don't get funded in 1 year, but I would recommend that we go ahead with the 13.
Thank you. And that's the motion on the floor. So we have a motion, we have a second. Any more discussion on the motion? I'm going to ask for a roll call vote.
Supervisor Ellenberg,
Yes.
Supervisor Simidian,
Yes.
Supervisor Cortese,
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman,
Aye.
President Chavez.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Supervisor Simonian?
Thank you. That takes us to item number 7, where the Harvey Rose folks have said that they think, given the reduced number of inmates, that we should be able to achieve some savings and therefore reductions with respect to clothing, food, and supplies. The administration counters and says, yes, but we've got some other countervailing increased costs as a result of the COVID situation, and that they're not ready to accept that the reductions can be made. I am prepared to support the staff recommendation, the administration's position today, and would move that we do so, but would ask that this item come back to our board in the November budget deliberations after we've got some analysis of whether or not these savings are in fact being realized. We'll have some more experience by then, and we can make an informed judgment at that point about the savings versus increased costs. So move the administrative position, but with a refer back to our board in November, request of the administration to provide additional information, and the same request to Harvey Rose.
So we have a motion. Do we have a second? We have a second from Supervisor Wasserman. Any discussion on the motion? I just had one request of staff as they're taking a look at this. One of my concerns about this line item is that we remove the inmate welfare fund, you know, the family, you know, having people pay. And I am worried about impacts, just because I feel like that's been a thin part of the budget already. So as you take a look at it, I'm going to be interested in understanding whether or not we've done the things that we told people we would do, which is having more clothing and more often for people to get it washed and the like, that we're sticking to that, you know, to the work we've already done in this area. So with that, we have a motion, we have a second. May I get a roll call? Any other discussion on the motion? Roll call vote, please.
Supervisor Ellenberg,
Yes.
Supervisor Simidian,
Yes.
Supervisor Cortese,
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman,
Yes.
President Chavez.
Yes.
Thank you.
We're now on item 8.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, on this one, I'm afraid I need to hear a little bit from both the Harvey Rose folks and the administration. The Harvey Rose folks have identified reductions in deferred maintenance that they believe can be achieved without adversely affecting what we actually perform in the way of deferred maintenance, because we always budget the money, but somehow can't seem to spend it in a timely basis, which is why we have an accumulated balance of, you know, well over twice the amount of an annual expenditure or budget, I should say. The administration disagrees. I think all of you know I've been an advocate for this deferred maintenance spending, because I think it's money that's well invested and it saves us money over time. On the other hand, if we aren't spending it on a timely basis, we might as well recognize the budget savings appropriate to that. So if we could go briefly to Ms. Solich, Madam Chair, and then to Dr. Smith's team, that would help me understand the back and forth a little bit better before offering a motion.
Thank you. Cheryl?
Yes. Well, exactly what Supervisor Simidian said is, you know, we're not proposing to in any way defund or stop deferred maintenance, which we would argue is, you know, we need more of it, not less. But the reality is, with the vacancies and other factors, it's very difficult for the department to actually spend those dollars. And so it is exactly as Supervisor Smidian said, we're looking at just ways to recognize the underspending, not proposing that this be, you know, the way it should be. It's just the way it is.
And President Chavez, this is Greg Ituria. We took a deep look at this over the last couple of weeks for, you know, same interest that everyone else has. If there isn't the need to spend this, which I think all know there is a need for deferred maintenance, or the ability, then we wanted to be able to concur or partially concur. And going over this to a great extent with FAF management, we see that there are several high dollar multi-year projects that are wrapping up this summer and this fall, that we expect to be fully expended by December, and then which will allow them to embark on many other projects. One of the limitations we've had in recent years is in the deployment of the project managers to carry out a lot of the work. A lot of that work's been focused on new capital projects because there's just been so many in the last couple of years, particularly with the acquisitions of the hospitals. And so internally, FAF is redirecting the deployment of those capital project managers to focus on this much needed deferred maintenance work. So there's going to be a lot more attention to actually get these projects through this fiscal year. So based on that work plan, we think it's quite reasonable that they'll use this allocation and help us catch up on this, you know, much needed deferred maintenance.
That being said, through the chair, if I may, Mr. Ituria, my understanding is that there's a carryover of $26.7 million already from last year. Is that correct?
At the end of last fiscal year. Yeah, that doesn't include what's already being spent so far this fiscal year.
And if we put the other 12 million in, then you're looking at 38.7 million to use for these purposes. Do you really think there's a way you're going to spend $38.7 million on deferred maintenance? If you could do it and do it responsibly, I'd say congratulations. I'm glad you found a way to do it, but it's not at all consistent with what our experience has been.
Yeah, maybe I can see if Jeff Draper is on the line here. Hopefully he is. And I know part of the work plan they're working on is how to divert the resources to do just that. But let's ask Jeff to speak up.
Yeah, this is Jeff. Good afternoon, supervisors. I believe that $26 million, unless I'm mistaken, includes the 12. I just want to make sure that I'm correct on that, Greg. That's part of the issue. And then as far as redeploying the capital project managers, yes, we are in fact doing that to get through all that. I think the biggest concern I have, obviously, is the ability to contract for all of it. Our job order contract, our new job order contracts are getting in place. That'll be very helpful, as well as some of these will be individual projects that'll be coming to the board for award, and I'm confident we'll get through it.
Madam Chairman, I'm still not that confident, but as a nod to the staff's commitment, what I would be prepared to do is, on item number 8, move the administrative position, but revisit in both November and February, and let's ask the staff then, how's that effort going? And I got to say bluntly now, as just one board member, you know, if we aren't spending the money in a timely and effective fashion, I think we're going to want to, realize those savings for this year, just because it's a budget solution that will be at hand without causing much pain if we're not actually able to spend the money thoughtfully. So I'll move this.
I'll second all of the sentiments that you just expressed. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a motion and we have a second. Any, Cheryl, did you want to weigh in?
No, I think we can come back and in November and February.
Okay, your box lit up. That's what got me to respond to you. All right, so we have a motion and a second to take no action on this, but to get a report back on this revenue through, and I'm not sure if I actually think this should go back through committee before it comes back to us, so someone takes a deep dive on it. And I don't know if it's more appropriate to have this go to Hewlett or FGOC. Dave, do you have a preference, or Mike, is it yours or is it FGOC?
It's FGOC's,
Okay.
Madam President, yes.
Thank you. So we'll have this take a stop by FGOC before it comes back. And we'll use that same October date so that we get all the information back from our colleagues. If that's all right with the maker of the motion and the seconder?
It is.
It is.
All right, so we ask for a roll call vote.
Supervisor Ellenberg,
Yes.
Supervisor Semidion,
Aye.
Supervisor Cortese,
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman,
Aye.
President Chavez.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you very much. We'll go to item 9.
Thank you. Item 9 is a question of general fund transfers for capital projects that have not commenced. The recommendation from the Rose organization was for projects which totaled 61.5 million to be accessed as budget relief. The administration has come back and said actually they would prefer to do 31.5 million. And I think they have proposed a reasonable compromise. So it's a partially agree, and I would move approval of that partially agree.
Second.
Any discussion on that motion? We have a motion from Supervisor Semidion and a second from Supervisor Ellenberg. I think that the one request I would like to make is that this same discussion that would be touched on in FGOC, again, just to get a sense of where we really are. And I think part of it, and I just want to really commend Jeff Draper and his team, that I think they really are trying their very best to move projects as quickly as possible. It's also just to remind my colleagues that countercyclical investment is actually really important right now. And so I'm also just mindful of that. So if it's okay that FGOC at least just get an update on this action, before November would be helpful from my perspective. Is that all right with the maker of the motion and the seconder?
Absolutely.
Great. So we have a motion, we have a second with a minor adjustment. May I ask for a roll call vote?
Supervisor Ellenberg,
Yes.
Supervisor Semidion,
Aye.
Supervisor Cortese,
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman,
Yes.
President Chavez.
Yes.
Thank you.
And on item number 10, Madam Chair and colleagues, facilities and fleet, the Rose organization has recommended possible savings based on what the actual contract expenditures have been over the last couple of years. The administration has come back with a proposal that is somewhat less, but nonetheless addresses that potential savings to the tune of about 1.3 rather than 3.5 million. If we had more time, I'd discuss it at greater length, but we don't. So I'm just going to move the administration's position, which is an effort to achieve some of the savings that were identified by the Rose organization.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
A second from Supervisor Wasserman. Any discussion on this motion? Roll call vote.
Supervisor Ellenberg,
Yes.
Supervisor Semidion,
Aye.
Supervisor Cortese,
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman,
Yes.
President Chavez.
Yes.
Thank you.
Item 11.
Item 11 is a suggestion from the Rose organization that given the presence of $12 million in our EMS trust fund, that we use 2.1 million of that revenue rather than a general fund subsidy to pay for our EMS operations. My understanding is that the administration concurs, but has expressed concern about the sustainability of that approach for future years, to which I would say duly noted, but let's take the solution now while we can. That's 2.1 million. So I would move approval of the recommendation from Harvey Rose, which I believe the administration concurs in.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Yes.
A second from Supervisor Wasserman. Are there any questions on this item? I had one, and I wanted to make sure I understood the point that Supervisor Simidian just raised. And that is, if I could ask staff, this 2.1 million would ease ease a cost that we would be paying out of the general fund. I just want to confirm that.
Yes, this is Greg Ituria. This is the amount that is the general fund portion of the EMS agency's budget. And so the proposal is to use some of the EMS trust funds to pay for what would otherwise be the general fund subsidy towards those costs.
And may I ask why we have a general fund subsidy for this cost?
Well, just historically, they've only used the trust proceeds, these fine and other revenues that they've collected to partially offset that cost. So that has been, or at least for my 6 years here, that's been our historical baseline practice.
I can answer more of that.
Thank you.
Basically, when the last, well, 2 RFPs ago, there was not a franchise fee charged, and so all of the expenditures for the department came out of general fund. When the last RFP was done, the proposal added some money for a franchise fee and fairly stiff penalties, which is what created the trust fund, but it wasn't considered kosher to use it to make it high enough to pay for the entire department. So there were still some general fund needs. However, this proposal suggests using part of the accumulated amount to pay for that general fund component, which certainly seems reasonable.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the history. That's really helpful. I will tell my colleagues that one of the reasons this caught my attention is that we, through the Office of Gender-Based Violence, we've been making some changes to EMS that are supportive of the work that we're doing and relative to our safe practices in both North and South County, as well as in the center of San Jose. And so I wanted to make sure that we protected resources if they were necessary to complete the projects that we're working on to safely transport victims of domestic violence or sexual assault. That's what prompted my question. Thank you very much, though, for that history. If there are no other questions, may I ask for a roll call vote?
Supervisor Ellenberg?
Yes.
Supervisor Simidian?
Aye.
Supervisor Cortese?
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman?
Yes.
President Chavez?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Item number 12 is a small item, less than $300,000 of scooping up some cash. The Harvey Rose and the administration agree, and I would move approval.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion on this motion? May I have a roll call vote?
Supervisor Ellenberg?
Yes.
Supervisor Simidian?
Aye.
Supervisor Cortese?
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman?
Aye.
President Chavez?
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
And Madam President, on items 13 and 14, which deal with the Valley Medical Center, I'd like to take the conversation briefly to both places and ask Ms. Solov and then the county executives team. My reading of item 13 is that the proposed utilities budget for VMC is 15.1 million, which is an 8% increase over the budgeted amount for the previous fiscal year and 13% over the actual spending for the previous fiscal year. And the Rose organization believes that that those numbers are appreciably higher than they need to be, given that the average cost of inflation has been about 4% for electricity and less than that for gas and water. The division recommends a 7% increase, which would be 14.3 million, still above what we've seen in the past, and would save about $750,000. The administration is listed as only partially agreeing, and I don't know what that's about. I do understand on the pharmaceutical costs, item 14, that is addressed in tomorrow's budget proposal for VMC, but I don't believe that the administration had addressed the utilities budget in tomorrow's proposal. So I'm wondering, is there some reason we shouldn't take the $774,000 in savings on utilities that's been proposed?
No, it's okay. We can move ahead.
All right, then I'll move approval of item 13, which is the recommended savings on utilities budget for VMC, if there's a second.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Oh my goodness. Is that Max doing that, Mike, or is that you?
That's me.
All right. We have a motion and a second. Any discussion on this motion? Seeing none, let's get a roll call vote.
Supervisor Ellenberg?
Yep. Yes.
Supervisor Semidion?
Aye.
Supervisor Cortese?
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman?
Yes.
President Chavez?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
And last item is item 14, and it may or may not require action by our board today. Dr. Smith, my recollection is that the budget for tomorrow has a $25 million reduction in services and supplies budget, which I think is actually greater than what was proposed for savings in items 13 and 14. Am I remembering that correctly? Will we be taking that up tomorrow?
Yes.
Then, Madam Chair, I would say no action on item 14, and we'll consider the potential savings in tomorrow's budget.
So we have a no action. Do we need a motion for that, James?
How about without objection, we'll continue this item till tomorrow's VMC budget, Madam Chair.
I like that process, without objection. All right.
That works.
All right, thank you. Thanks very much. All right, so we're gonna go to items 8 and 9 under the same section.
I think we need to do items 6 and 7, just a motion to receive the report, and I'm happy to make that motion, Madam Chair, on both items.
We have a motion to receive the reports for 6 and 7. Do we have a second?
Yes.
A second from Supervisor Wasserman. Any discussion on those motions? Seeing none, we'll take a roll call vote.
Supervisor Ellenberg?
Yes.
Supervisor Semidion?
Aye.
Supervisor Cortese? Vice President Wasserman?
Aye.
President Chavez?
Yes.
Thank you.
So items 8 and 9.
Yes, this is Greg Itorio. Item number 8 is to consider a revised recommendation to adjust the special programs budget because of the allocation of the reserve for inventory items has been allocated out to the departments that are going to be executing the grant contracts. I asked the board to refer this item for final consideration on Friday.
So we
second.
have a second. Any discussion on the motion? And we're taking both items 8 and 9
Together.
Thank you. We have a motion. We have a second. Is there any discussion on this item? Seeing none, may I ask for a roll call vote?
Madam President, I take it you have no speakers.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for catching that. I do have one. I apologize so much. I'm sorry. We'll take the public speaker now. Thank you for catching that, Mike.
Sure.
Our speaker is Bree Moeller. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you will have 1 minute to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Hi, my name is Brianna and I'm a constituent of District 4. My goal for this comment is to offer what I, as a constituent of Santa Clara County, would like to see from the board in addressing the deficit, and also to amplify the voices of members in my community. First, I think it's imperative that the board consider divestment from the Office of the Sheriff and the Office of District Attorney, whose budget, if I looked at the documents correctly, are approximately $142 million and $189 million respectively. As a constituent of Santa Clara County, I would like to see the board consider removing deputies in the Office of Sheriff who have discipline and misconduct claims in their record, eliminating the DA's racist gang prosecution unit, and eliminating any and all funding that goes towards the inhumane and barbaric use of police canines in the apprehension of human beings. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Scott Largent. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you will have 1 minute to speak. The timer will begin when you begin speaking.
Good afternoon, everyone. Scott Largent. I got a little distracted there, so I don't think I'm off topic. I kind of listened to what the last gal had to say. Suggestion, we need a couple different attorneys at the public defender's office that maybe we could budget for, possibly a family law attorney, and then also somebody with a little bit of the civil background that can help members of the public out that are being, pushed through that dragnet now in our county. I've talked about the civil channel and how people like myself are being abused. Our civil rights are being, just chucked out the door. And I keep getting the same response from the public defender's office. We don't handle it. There's state statutes in place that don't allow us to do anything. You would think over time that they would want to step to the plate, that they would want to start protecting people more. And I keep asking the board to do something like that. Family law attorney in the beginning of all this would have told me to remain silent, wait till my criminal proceeding was done, then go back in there and fight for my kid. It's as simple as that. I didn't have that representation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to go on, and I just will say to my colleagues, we're going to end at 5 today. What I'd like to do, if it's all right, is take the office of the county exec and see, get a brief presentation from staff, and then we can take action. I apologize. Let me just make sure. So we're on item 13. Under the Office of County Exec, 10, 11, and 12, we already.
Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
I believe we need a vote on 8 and 9.
Thank you. Boy, I got to get it together. All right. Can we take a roll call vote? Thank you.
Supervisor Ellenberg.
Yes.
Supervisor Simidian.
Aye.
Supervisor Cortese.
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman.
Aye.
President Chavez.
Yes. Thank you.
Madam.
So as we, Supervisor Wasserman, let me just finish this thought and then I'll come to you. So to my colleagues, we have about 15 minutes. What I wanted to do was take the Office of the County Executive. What I wanted to do was give the county an opportunity to present, then go to questions, and then determine whether or not we can take one vote on the section. We may not be able to if people have particular items they'd like to remove. That would be my recommendation about how to proceed. Supervisor Wasserman?
Thank you. I was going to make a motion for approval of 13 through 31 as recommended by staff. I don't know if there's support for that or not.
Do we have a motion? Do we have a second?
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion on the motion? So seeing none, then let me just say that there are a couple of areas that I would like to ask a few questions of. And if I could ask whoever the most appropriate person is to give feedback to the following. I'm interested in the positions that are item 15. And this is the mediation and ombudsman services. And one of my concerns with deleting a senior mediator, as I have understood that we're trying to use our mediators to support people who are having challenges between tenant and landlords during the COVID-19 crisis. Could someone talk just a little bit about that position and whether or not that position is needed for that purpose?
Supervisor, this is Miguel Marquez. And so that office, I'm looking at our CEO roster and it has about 13 or 14 people in it. The thinking was, since this position was vacant and just given the budget circumstance, that they would have sufficient capacity left in the other 13 staff that are still there to take on that work.
Do we have in those positions another senior mediator? And again, part of the reason I'm asking this question is that the sophistication level of some of the challenges we're having has led me to wonder whether or not, and by the way, this is part of the reason I would like to give the departments flexibility so that if they could live within a certain budget with their positions, they could make decisions like this instead of me asking about it at such a minute level. But do we have another or two senior mediators?
I don't have that detail in front of me, but I am sending an email now to see if I can get that answer for you before we finish up.
Great, thank you.
President Chavez, this is John Mills. So yes, the Office of Mediation and Ombud Services, it's structured into two units, and each of those units is staffed by some number of senior mediators. So to your question, there are other senior mediators among that 13 FTE that Miguel referenced, who are able to reprioritize their work to accommodate the tenant landlord concerns that you referenced.
Great, thank you. Thank you. And then on item 16, I know this was a new office that this is the Countywide Office of Contract Management. And what I'm curious about is, with this change, does the Office of Contract Management in essence move over to the procurement office?
This is Miguel again. No, it wouldn't. It would stay here on the 11th floor, but would be overseen instead of by the director of OCCM, who in turn had been overseen by the chief procurement officer. Instead, our new chief procurement officer, Gene Clark, will take on the responsibility of overseeing OCCM and will collaborate with the two leads in that department to manage the work.
And may I ask, how big is that department now?
There are, I believe it's 5 or 6, but I'll verify that here in a heartbeat.
Thank you.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's 5 people.
I think one thing that I would like to know, and maybe this comes as part of the October budget, is whether or not the team should move over to procurement, actually be part of that team, because I think, Miguel, my recollection is that this is something you did to really strengthen that office while we were restructuring it. And I'd just be interested in understanding the role of its work relative to whatever that restructuring looks like as we move forward. Because I know you guys have done a lot of the work that you set out, or at least are moving it in the right direction. So just a question, if we could talk about that when we're discussing budget in October, November.
Will do, and I can tell you that I've had conversation with our chief procurement officer, and he's looking at, he's new and with a fresh eye, and he's looking at better ways of doing it, and that's certainly something for him to consider.
Yeah, thank you. On item 20, one question I had, this is the revised recommendation relative to the Equal Opportunity Department. Never mind. I misunderstood what that one was for. I'm okay there. I'm now going to the, I'm sorry, I'm looking for the Sustainability Office. Let me look, I missed my number. What I was curious about is we're in the process of developing a sustainability plan that looks like it's pretty significant, and I'm concerned about the removal of this person and really wanting to better understand what the impact to that sustainability plan is, since that appears to me a core body of work that we've been building up on over a while. This is item 22.
Supervisor Chavez, this is Sylvia Gallegos, Deputy County Executive. We have Jasneet Sharma, our Sustainability Director, in this meeting, so I would ask her to respond to your question.
Yeah, Sylvia, thank you. Supervisor Chavez, I just want to make sure you can hear me.
I can.
Absolutely. So yes, we are trying to think through or have given some thought to how we would reallocate some of this work. You are right, it is going to have some impacts on our ability to move forward with or move full speed ahead with the sustainability master plan, but we are trying to give some thought to how much can we absorb through some of our other management analysts, and are there some partnerships we can have with the other departments to support their work as well?
Thank you. Those are all my questions for this section. Oh, actually, can I ask, I do have one other question, and this is a question for Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith, I know recently you made a promotion, and which I think is great, into the leadership of your team. Do you see your team needing to expand? And I say this recognizing that we have lots of employees and lots of departments and lots of budget units. And I've really been reflecting on the point you raised about how few people that you have that are actually working on the board's priorities. And I know how hard your staff is working. I'm just curious if this is an area you are going to be coming back to us with any senior positions on your team over the next 6 months to a year.
Well, thank you for asking. I should probably clarify my comment about only 30 people. I meant only 30 people working on transmittals. There's lots of other people implementing the transmittals, but you're right, everybody is pushed pretty hard and all the departments are pushed pretty hard. What we did with the promotion of Key Lee is the position that Bruce Knopf had left, we did an add delete. So basically he was moved into that position. So that was not a huge expense, and I don't expect any huge expense during this time of expansion. I don't see us getting bigger as you did today. I see us getting smaller in this office.
I think one of the concerns, and I'll just say this to my colleagues, I think having, 1 or 2 more senior staff may be, it may just be a necessity longer term. I do think the organization has gotten, well, anyway, I think having senior staff, because I do think that sometimes the challenges that we have is that you have very few people that more complex policies are going through, and I just think that's very hard both for you and your staff, but also to get them implemented, because it's a finite amount of resource that you have there. So, but thank you very much for that, and appreciate you put so many ideas forward to balance the budget. Thanks for that. So with that, to go back to Supervisor Wasserman, could you restate your motion? Because your motion was 13 through
31, Madam President. Happy to call for a vote if there's no speakers.
We have no speakers on this item. So 13 through 31. And I forgot, Supervisor Wasserman, who was your second?
Supervisor Smitty.
Great. We have a motion and a second. Can we get a roll call vote? And this vote is to move these items to the Friday agenda.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes.
Supervisor Ellenberg?
Yes.
Supervisor Simidian?
Simidian, aye.
Supervisor Cortese?
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman?
Aye.
President Chavez?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we just have a couple more minutes.
I'd be happy to do more of the same if you wish.
I think I would ask my colleagues, are there any items that you want to take a deeper dive into that are in front of us today? And this, let me just say, the sections that we have are the Office of the Assessor, the Procurement Department, I think the Registrar, and we already took 35, is that right?
Yes, 35 was done.
Yeah, so this would be the Registrar and TSS, County Com, Fleets and Facilities. Yeah, it's kind of a lot.
Now, county comms, we've already approved.
Yes, we have EFA and finance.
TSS and facilities and fleets, we made comments on during number 4. So I'm not sure if we need to do that again. It is potentially possible unless there are a lot of questions on procurement and ROV that we could get it done.
What doesn't one of you make a motion if you'd like to do so? And
I'll be happy to if you wish.
go ahead.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd make a motion to approve items 33 and 34 as in our agenda and refer them to Friday.
So any discussion? We have a motion. Do we have a second?
So second.
Okay, we have a motion, second. Any discussion on the motion?
Can you restate the items, please, one more time?
Yes,
33 and 34.
Sorry, procurement
No
department.
problem. Procurement.
Okay, thank you.
So we have a motion and a second. We have no public speakers on this item. May I have a roll call vote?
Supervisor Ellenberg,
Yes.
Supervisor Semidian,
Semidian, aye.
Supervisor Cortese,
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman,
Aye.
President Chavez.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to item 36. This is the Office of the Registrar of Voters.
And 37, if I may include them together, Madam President.
Please do.
Thank you. A motion to approve 36 and 37 as in the staff report and forward them to Friday.
I'll second it, but I have two quick questions that I'd like to ask, please.
Please go ahead.
We do that. The reason that the administration gives for the increase is the November election, but I'd like to know why it's budgeted as ongoing instead of the increase is budgeted as ongoing instead of expenditure.
You know what, Susan, you cut out. I'm sorry.
Oh, am I back?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Sorry.
The reason that administration gives for the increase is the November election, which I completely understand, but why is this budgeted as ongoing then rather than as one-time expenditure?
Yeah, this is Greg Ituria. Yeah, that's a good point. There was a judgment call. One of the arguments we heard from the department is that even in non-presidential years, you'll have elections of a general nature for whether it's for a primary or for the statewide that we do every other year as well for the statewide offices. I think there's a fair argument either way, whether it should be ongoing or one time. The recommendation is for ongoing, but certainly if the board would rather do it at a one-time basis, we can make that adjustment as well.
My preference.
Whoops.
I'm sorry.
Go
ahead, Dr. Smith.
Add a little bit more. The office is very concerned about the Voters' Choice Act and implementation and what it will mean in the future. So I think there's natural hesitancy on their part to say that it's never going to happen again. But as Greg says, it's the board's discretion. We can certainly do it one time if you'd like to do that.
My preference would be one time and then revisit it next year and see if this is a continuing need. I think that it's, we're asking many departments to downsize and to make do with what they have. And I would like to see this for the moment be budgeted as a one-time expenditure if my colleagues support that. But the other question I want to ask is, in light of the news reports around the USPS cuts, what does the ROV need to set up a sufficient number of ballot collection locations throughout the county? And does that increased number include that contemplation?
We're still evaluating that because the information from USPS just came down the pike. We probably will have to come back and either do a realignment or possibly take it out of service and supplies, but we don't have a number right now.
Okay, so I'd like to get a report back on that. It doesn't have to be by the time we get the agenda. If we can get that in a week or so, that's fine, since we'll come back anyway. And I certainly am supportive of doing whatever we need to do to get through this election. But my preference, again, to my colleagues would be that this is a one-time funding associated with the 2020 election.
So that's part of the motion, that it's one time. May I make a what's that?
I accept.
Great.
Thank you
so much. The one thing I was going to recommend is that rather than wait, I would recommend that as part of Dr. Smith's report out at the next Tuesday's board meeting, that we just get an update on what's happening. I think this is moving really quickly and we could miss it if we
Great.
wait.
Okay.
Are you
That's
okay
a good
with
point.
that?
I am, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks. And also, I just will say out loud, I don't know if there's legal action that we're going to need to take either. So if those two things are the case, I think it would be good to know that Monday and Tuesday. All right, so we have a motion and a second, and we have no speakers on that. May I get a roll call vote?
Supervisor Ellenberg,
Yes.
Supervisor Semidion,
Committee aye.
Supervisor Cortese,
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman,
Aye.
President Chavez.
Yes, thank you.
Madam President?
Yes, sir. May I go to the next item before I get you? Is that all right? Mike, did you want to talk on this item?
No, I had an idea about the remaining items, given what departments they were.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. I would make a motion that we approve staff's recommendation and move these forward to Friday. Items 38, 39, and 40 in our tech department, 42 through 47, facilities and fleet, 48 and 49, which is our wonderful library, 50 and 51, ESA, and 52 and 53, which is finance.
Second that.
So we have a motion and a second. Any discussion on those items? I think that's fine. And we have no public speakers. I'm going to be a no vote on this section, in part because I just want to highlight for my colleagues that I am concerned about how we're approaching AB 109 based on a number of other actions that we're taking, including the way we're supporting the jails. It's a small amount of the TSS solutions department. And it might, well, actually, let me just say this. I'm going to support moving this to Friday, but this is an area that I have concern that may cause me to vote no on the budget overall. So I just wanted to highlight that. It's very small in TSS, but I was just going to raise it there. As it relates to fleets and facilities, I have concern about the elevator mechanic because I've seen us wait for contracts for people to come and fix elevators. I think that's a public safety issue, and so I'm uncomfortable with that action. And there was one other one. Anyway, those are the ones that are on my mind right now. Oh, and then, yeah, anyway, those are my concerns. So with that, are there any other comments on the motion? Seeing none, I'll ask for a roll call vote.
Supervisor Ellenberg,
Yes.
Supervisor Semidion,
Committee aye.
Supervisor Cortese,
Aye.
Vice President Wasserman,
Yes.
President Chavez.
Yes, so
Thank
moving
you.
this till Friday. Thank you. All right, well, I don't think we have anything else for today. We have no other public speakers. We don't have anything to consider. I'm sorry, items 54, any concern or referral to the administration? Seeing none, we are recessed until tomorrow at 1:30.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
I second that. Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Bye-bye.